This trashy little girl thinks she can fix a Mustang? I'll break your hands right now, the cop screamed in Victor Hayes' face, as he stood helplessly watching the multi-million-dollar car stall on the Twilight Highway. But Mira lifted her head, her face streaked with sweat, her small hand gripping the wrench. And in that exact moment, the ring blazing on her finger stunned Victor like a slap to the face. This was no longer about fixing a case. It was about a family secret laid bare, police power shattered, and a millionaire tasting humiliation for the first time. You think you can look away? Watch to the end, because a single ring is all it takes to rip apart the false world the powerful are hiding. The sun was fading at the horizon, casting an orange-red hue over the endless stretch of desert. The wind swept across, carrying sand that stung the skin. The sleek black Mustang sat dead in the middle of the road like a wounded beast, smoke rising from the hood, the acrid smell of oil and burnt metal filling the air. Victor Hayes stood beside it, tie loosened, face flushed red, veins bulging at his temples. He slammed his palm hard on the hood, voice low and seething. All that money and you betray me now. The sound echoed across the empty space, making his frustration even sharper. A patrol car's siren blared from afar, red and blue lights slicing through the twilight. Two officers emerged, stepping out slowly, boots crunching on gravel. They walked up with sneering smiles, not even pretending to help. One of them jerked his chin toward the Mustang and sneered, "Oh, fancy Mustang broke down like this? Maybe you're playing tax fraud, flashing dirty money on a car to show off." His voice was shrill, raised on purpose to drown out the wind. The other laughed loudly, tapping rhythmically on the butt of his gun, eyes full of mockery. Victor clenched his fists but held back, knowing any reaction could make him their target. In that tense moment, a small figure appeared at the edge of the road. A little black girl with frizzy hair, face dusty and worn, carrying an old toolkit. Her tattered sandals scraped the ground with each step. She stopped a few meters away, her dark eyes gleaming with unusual defiance. Her arrival cracked the scene like a fracture. The two officers immediately turned, eyes sharp. One snapped with a commanding tone. "Hey, kid! Scram! This isn't your place!" Victor turned, noticing the child for the first time. His gaze held surprise and a touch of irritation. A girl showing up now, in the middle of this desolate highway, meant more trouble. But she didn't step back. Her name was Mira. She squinted at the towering men before her, hand still gripping the tool bag. The wind tossed strands of sweaty curls around her face, highlighting the stark contrast between her small frame and unshaken presence. The officer stepped closer, voice harsh. "Go home, kid. Can't you see this is grown-up business?" He jerked his chin at Victor as if to drive the point, then turned and smirked at his partner. Hilarious. A fancy Mustang getting fixed by some little black girl. Bet the press would love this scene. Their laughter rang sharp, slicing the air like blades in the wind. Victor grew more agitated. He was used to respect, and had never been spoken to with such contempt. He was about to snap back, but his eyes turned to Mira. She wasn't afraid. In fact, her gaze was calm and strangely firm. She stepped forward, placed the tool bag on the ground, and said in a hoarse but steady voice, "Your spark plugs are clogged. I can fix it." The words dropped like a stone into a still lake, making all three men freeze in place. The cop burst out laughing, clapping mockingly. "Did you hear that, big shot? A filthy little kid claims she can fix a Mustang. Funniest thing I've heard all century." The other one threw his head back in hysteric, shaking his head as he added, "Maybe she plans to strip it down and sell it for scrap to match her budget." Victor frowned slightly, a mix of confusion and irritation. He had never trusted anyone but professional engineers, and certainly not a child who looked like she had walked out of a junkyard. But in that moment, Mira's confidence didn't waver. She slowly unzipped the rusted bag, revealing old tools carefully preserved. The sunset caught the worn metal, making a few pieces glint, and for a brief second, Victor found himself drawn in. The air on the highway was tight as wire, wind still slicing through the wild grass. The cops kept piling on the mockery, their voices venomous, each word meant to crush whatever fragile courage Mira had left. "Who do you think you are touching this beast? One wrong turn and the whole thing goes up in flames, taking that dumb rich guy with it." Their laughter cracked, harsh and filthy. Victor stood caught between two forces. On one side, the humiliation coming from men he once believed upheld the law, and on the other, the fierce resolve burning in a little girl's eyes. He took a quiet breath, something shifting inside. She still stood there, unmoving, head high, her small hand gripping the wrench like it was the only weapon she had against the entire world. In the deepening sunset, Victor Hayes suddenly realized that what had broken down today wasn't just a Mustang, but also his old faith in power and the protection he once thought was absolute. The silence stretched on, broken only by the wind rustling through dry weeds and the Mustang's engine groaning in hoarse, dying gasps. The girl took a deep breath, her hand trembling, but her voice rang out clearer than anything Victor Hayes had ever heard from a child. "I'm Mira. I know how to fix it." The words landed heavy in the thick air, like a sudden spark tossed into dry straw. Victor turned to look at her, his eyes shifting from irritation to surprise, then softening into a faint, mocking smile. "A filthy little kid trying to teach me about a Mustang?" He laughed, but the sound was hollow, betraying his doubt. The two officers seized the moment, sharp whistles slicing the air, thickening the already suffocating tension. One raised an eyebrow and leaned in close to Mira, blowing smoke-tainted breath into her face, his voice full of baiting menace. "That's right, let's see her turn your car into a coffin." The other burst out laughing, slapping the butt of his gun while growling, "Go on then. I want to see this filthy brat blow up a Mustang worth hundreds of thousands of dollars." Their laughter echoed down the highway, so cruel and cutting that even Victor frowned. But before he could speak, Mira had already bent down and quietly opened her worn-out bag. The rusty zipper cracked open, revealing a set of tools, dull, corroded, but meticulously arranged. Her eyes were steady, her dark pupils gleaming with resolve that silenced all three men. Mira didn't blink. Her voice came out hoarse but firm. "It's just clogged spark plugs. I can fix it." Victor stood frozen. The doubt still clung to him, but in that moment, something else crept in. A small, grimy child, threatened by two full-grown cops, yet still able to say those words, unshaken, unflinching. The way she held the tools, the way her eyes caught the fading light, none of it felt like a joke. And somehow, that made Victor even more uneasy. He lived in a world where everything was backed by degrees, engineers, professionals. And now here was a girl with nothing but an old bag. One of the officers sneered, "Hear that, rich man? She's talking spark plugs like she read it in a car manual. Tragic. When a piece of trash knows more than you do." The insult cut like blades. Victor looked over at Mira, waiting to see her flinch. But she didn't blink, just silently pulled out a wrench, her tiny fingers clinging to it like it was her only source of strength. The wind struck harder, dust swirling thick in the air, the sky darkening fast. Victor frowned slightly, exhaling, caught between doubt and curiosity. Part of him wanted to wave the girl away and leave the car for roadside rescue, but another part held him still, drawn by that unshaken look in her eyes. In those small eyes, Victor saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. Absolute belief in oneself. A kind of belief that ignored mockery, ignored fear. The second officer stepped closer, crouching near Mira, his voice like a cold blade. "Hey, kid, if you mess up even one bolt, this big shot's going to pin the blame on you. Think you can carry that?" He sneered, a half-smile designed to crush her with his stare. Mira slowly lifted her head, her eyes glossy but burning, and answered with a single clear line, "I can carry it." The reply landed in silence, and Victor felt his heart skip for a moment. He looked at her smudged but steady face, then glanced at the two officers, now scowling at being defied. In the fading sunset, the whole scene felt unreal. A thin girl staring down power without flinching, and him, a millionaire used to commanding others, just standing there, watching, not pushing her away. The air thickened, the mocking laughter of the cops now a hollow noise. Mira gripped the wrench with both hands, placed it on the spark plug, and leaned in, beginning the work quietly. Her movements weren't rushed, not frantic, but precise, slow, as if every step had been deeply learned. Victor kept watching, frustration bubbling under the surface, but unable to look away. Twilight on the highway, a smoking Mustang, cops circling, and in the center, a small girl declaring she could fix it. The image froze the moment, etched into Victor's memory. He suddenly understood. This was no longer about a broken car, but about defiance, about courage, and maybe the start of something he couldn't yet name. The clinking of the wrench had barely started when a rough hand lunged forward. The largest cop kicked the tool bag aside, then snatched the wrench from Mira's hand and hurled it to the pavement. Metal slammed against cracked asphalt with a sharp clang, slicing through the tense silence of dusk like a blade. He spat, voice thick with contempt. "Trash. You're trying to play some cheap hero? A filthy little brat thinking she can fix a millionaire's car?" He dragged out the last two words, smearing both Mira and Victor in one breath. Victor's brow furrowed tight, blood rising to his face. He wasn't used to being spoken to with such arrogance, and even less so watching a child being treated so viciously right in front of him. His voice came out dry but firm. "Give it back to her." The line cut through their mocking laughter, but it didn't stop them. The other cop whipped around, eyes bloodshot with anger. He adjusted his belt, hand resting loosely on his gun, spat on the ground, and hissed, "Shut up. Guys like you don't give orders here." The air turned dense, heavy with the stench of cigarettes, exhaust, and open threats. Mira bent down, her hand trembling from the forceful grab, but her eyes didn't flinch. In the last light of day, her small face lifted, lips tight, then formed words that rang out clear and sharp. "You have power, but not reason. Her voice was pure, but solid as steel, freezing both Victor and the two officers in place. She didn't yell. She didn't shake. She threw the words straight at the men trying to crush her. Victor felt a sudden pinch in his chest. He was used to defiance backed by wealth and status. But that short sentence from Mira caught him off guard. A child, standing up to the police, daring to use logic as her weapon. For the first time, Victor froze, as if some small arrow had pierced through the thick walls of pride he'd built around himself. The taller cop let out a dry, choking laugh, voice low and rough. "Reason? What do you know about reason? Out here, we're the law. Your words mean nothing." He ground his boot down on the wrench, twisting the sole to crush the metal, the screech making Mira bite her lip until it bled. But instead of crying, she knelt quietly, gathering the scattered tools one by one, the rusted tweezers, the worn screwdriver, each picked up by her small, oil-streaked hands and wiped gently with her shirt. Victor didn't look away. Something strange was stirring inside him. A little girl, standing in the middle of humiliation, picking up her tools like they were her life. The gesture suddenly reminded him of his ex-wife, the one who once told him that strength doesn't come from shouting, but from standing firm in the face of scorn. "Stop picking that up, girl," the second cop hissed. "The more you gather, the more you prove you're trash made to crawl after junk. Lift your head and see. This world's not meant for your kind." He stepped forward and crushed a screwdriver underfoot, kicking it far off, forcing Mira to crawl after it. But she stayed patient, her hand trembling as she picked each item up, placing them back into the bag as if they were treasures. Victor felt a surge of heat flare in his chest. He had thought himself numb to injustice, but in that moment, Mira's defiance cut through everything he still believed in. He looked at her small face lifting, lip bloodied, eyes burning. She didn't cry, didn't beg, but stared straight into the heart of contempt. The words echoed in Victor's mind. "You have power, but not reason." A simple sentence, yet it ripped through the elaborate illusion he had built for years. The cops kept mocking, their laughter loud, each word like stones hurled at Mira. But she stood up, clutching the worn-out bag to her chest, her face streaked with sweat and dust. Mira didn't need to shout, didn't need to fight with force. She proved herself by standing after being shoved, with eyes that refused to waver. Victor swallowed the lump in his throat. Something inside him stirred. All his life, he believed power came from wealth, from contracts and shares. But the child before him was teaching him that real strength could come from small hands and unshaken belief. For the first time, he paused and admitted deep down that Mira held something he had long lost: the courage to face injustice without lowering herself. The highway was now soaked in orange-red light, and shadows stretched long across the cracked road. The wind blew sand against their skin, but no one moved. The mocking laughter faded, replaced by an odd stillness. Mira stood tall, her eyes locked on Victor, as if telling him he didn't have to believe her words, only the way she didn't back down. Victor hesitated, and inside him rose questions he'd never faced before. Why would a child dare to speak back to the police? Why did she still stand after being pushed that far? And why did he, a man of power, feel so small in front of that defiance? The questions dug deep, and for the first time, Victor felt himself losing control of the moment. On the empty road, the Mustang still smoked, but the air around it had shifted. Mira, with her old bag and blazing eyes, had turned the place into a small battlefield, where power was challenged not with money or violence, but with unbreakable courage. And in that moment, Victor Hayes, a millionaire who believed everything could be bought, was forced to stop, stand still, and admit a hard truth. Some things cannot be bought, and Mira had just proven it with her defiance. The scorching desert wind swept through, dragging with it thick waves of dust that blurred the patchy asphalt road. Dry cactus branches tilted by the roadside, swaying under the force of the relentless gusts. In the distance, the blood-red sun sank slowly like a burning coal, casting low light that stretched and distorted the shadows of the man and the Mustang across the cracked pavement. The Mustang sat still, faint smoke rising from the engine bay, the stench of burnt metal mixing with the dusty desert air and the stale cigarette breath of the two cops. The scene felt like an empty stage, with only 3 figures left in the vast desert, the atmosphere with humiliation. Victor Hayes stood upright, his expensive suit now dusty, chest heaving after being shoved and thrown down. He was used to cold air-conditioned rooms, polished wood furniture and respectful handshakes. Never had he imagined being knocked to the ground on a deserted road like some nobody. Before he could gather himself, one of the men shoved a hand into his jacket, yanked out his wallet, and pulled out the car documents he always kept neatly in a leather sleeve. The cop retrieved them like a trophy, sneered, tore the cover, and flipped through each page slowly, deliberately, turning the act into a show of disrespect. "Let's see if Big Shot Hayes is as clean as he looked," the man smirked. Victor growled, his voice hoarse with rage. "That's personal property. Give it back." But the words barely left his mouth before they were drowned out by the other cop's booming laugh. The man spat on the pavement, his raspy voice echoing through the empty space. "Rich or not, you're just another juicy target. Don't think that stack of junk paper's gonna save you." Victor clenched his fists, knuckles cracking, veins pulsing at his temples. He was used to walking into any room and commanding respect, used to his signature sending people into panic. But now, as the ones in uniforms meant to uphold justice acted like thugs, all that power slipped away like sand through his fingers. A crushing mix of shame and fury pressed against his chest, choking him. This was something he had never dared to imagine. Brazen, unrestrained abuse of power. Mira quietly stepped closer, her small, bloodied hand still gripping the tool bag. Dusty hair whipped back in the wind. Her frail shoulders trembled, but her eyes stayed firm. She leaned in, lowered her head near Victor's ear, her voice soft but heavy as stone. "This is our everyday life." The whisper made Victor shiver. It wasn't loud, didn't shout, but it carved out a world he had never seen, where small lives were stopped, searched, trampled on, just for their skin color and powerlessness. Victor turned to look at Mira, and saw in those dark eyes not fear, but familiarity. What was a nightmare to him was a repeating loop to her, a rhythm of life so constant it no longer shocked her. Victor felt a lump in his throat. It was dry, and all the words he wanted to say got stuck. He wanted to shout that this was wrong, wanted to use his name to crush their arrogance, but his chest tightened, because for the first time in his life, he felt as powerless as the crowd, the people he had only read about in headlines, in stories of injustice and oppression he'd always believed were far removed. The officers didn't stop at rummaging through his documents. One of them flung the car registration into the air, let it fall to the ground, then ground his heel into it, twisting as if to destroy it. The other flipped open Victor's wallet, glanced through the bank cards, and let out a mocking laugh. "All those numbers mean nothing when you're dealing with us." His laughter echoed, harsh and sharp, every word like a hammer pounding into Victor's growing helplessness. Victor tried to snatch his belongings back, but was met with a hard shoulder shove that sent him stumbling several steps, nearly falling. Dust flew up and clung to his fine coat, turning the image of a powerful millionaire into that of a man humiliated in the middle of the desert. He bent down to pick up the now dirty documents, his hands trembling, not just from rage, but from shame. His heart pounded wildly. After so many years, he felt himself being pushed down, dragged out of control. Mira stood close beside him, her small hand resting lightly on his arm, as if to steady him. Victor glanced down and saw those clear eyes shining in the dark, saw blood on her scraped knees, but her gaze held steady. He swallowed hard, not knowing what to say. In that moment, he realized he looked no different from the very people he had once ignored, once judged as weak, once believed their suffering was exaggerated. Now the truth was right in front of him, impossible to deny. The wind picked up, howling through the dry brush, scattering the fallen papers. A registration slip flew off, and Mira darted after it, her dirty little hand carefully returning it to Victor. He took it, eyes stinging, overcome by the strange feeling that he was the one being saved, not the Mustang. Mira's words echoed in his mind. "This is our everyday life." That word, everyday, weighed like lead, and Victor felt dizzy. To him, this was an unbearable nightmare. To Mira, it was a rhythm so familiar it barely registered. The two cops watched the scene and scoffed. One of them spoke up loudly, voice full of contempt. "Look at you two. A big shot and a filthy little brat, both the same. Trash under our feet." The words made Victor shiver, like a cold blade slicing through his chest. But at the same time, they made him see more clearly. He turned, eyes burning with anger, yet deep inside, flicker of something else lit up, like a new resolve had just sparked to life. He couldn't let this go on, couldn't stand by while a child was being trampled. But he also understood that the power he once held now carried no weight, at least not on this road, not this evening, not under the hands of men who saw him as nothing but a toy to break. Mira remained upright, chest rising and falling, lips cracked and bloodied, but her voice steady. She looked directly at the two officers, proud, fierce gaze shining, and whispered again, not just to Victor this time, but as if throwing the words straight in their faces, "You have power, but not justice." The words came out clean and cold, carried by the desert wind, and they sent a chill down Victor's spine. He swallowed hard, realizing for the first time that he now stood on the other side, the side of those who had no choices left. Powerlessness wrapped around him, but it also brought a different truth. If he, with all his money and name, could be crushed this easily, then people like Mira, people with nothing but grit and bare hands, what had they been forced to endure their whole lives? Victor Hayes, the man who once believed the world fit neatly in his grasp, now stood on a desolate highway, realizing his power had cracked. A deep fracture had opened, and from inside it, he saw the truth he had long chosen to ignore. The desert wind kept howling, and the last of the sun dipped behind distant mountains, leaving only twilight. But for Victor, this moment had become the dawn of a new awareness, an awakening that could not be undone. Victor stood frozen, his eyes locked on Mira's thin finger. The light from the ring caught in the fading sun, piercing straight into his chest like a drill. His whole body tensed, lips parting as his voice broke from a wave of emotion and confusion. That ring, where did it come from? The question came out like a whisper, but to him it thundered inside his ribcage, echoing with a heavy rhythm that forced him to face a truth he wasn't ready to name. Mira looked up, her face slick with sweat, dust streaking her forehead, her eyes blazing. She was panting, but her voice rang out so clearly that it silenced everything else. It was my mother's. A simple sentence, but to Victor, it struck like thunder on a clear sky. He staggered back a step, both hands clenched at his sides, blood rushing to his temples, turning his face bright red. The two cops glanced at each other, then burst into laughter, their vicious noise crashing into the space like it meant to crush the faintest spark of hope. One slapped his thigh, high-pitched. "Your mother?" More like ripped off from some jewelry store. The other bent over, mimicking Mira's tone. "It was my mother's. How sweet. But kids like this get everything from stealing anyway." Their gloating cackles rang on, every word heavy and meant to shatter Mira's small pride. Victor gritted his teeth, his hands trembling, veins rising across his knuckles. He felt anger and panic flood him all at once. That ring was unmistakable. He had seen it hundreds of times in the past, on the hand of a woman he had never truly forgotten, though he had buried that memory deep inside himself. And now, as the silver-green flash returned on a stranger's hand, all those memories came roaring back to life. Mira didn't flinch at the laughter, didn't lower her gaze. She looked straight at Victor, as if she already knew the questions erupting inside him. Her small face looked both childlike and far older than her years. Victor felt his throat tighten, words caught somewhere between rage and disbelief. He wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but he couldn't. Mira's burning stare held him in place, and for the first time in years, he was silent. The space around them felt strangled. The cops kept jeering, and one leaned in with a grin. "Rich man, you're pathetic, letting some black kid fool you with a cheap little sob story. Look at it. That ring's nothing but a petty theft." He leaned closer, voice dropping, sharp and cold. "Or maybe you already know, and you just like pretending it makes you merciful." Victor spun around, a flash of fury in his eyes. He felt insulted, but at the same time dragged deeper into confusion. Mira's words echoed again and again. "It was my mother's." He couldn't stop the flood of memories crashing in. Cold New York nights, a soft hand wearing that ring holding his, the gentle smile of a woman his family never accepted. Victor clenched his fists, his gaze flickering violently between doubt and a pain that cut deep. He couldn't deny the truth. The ring in front of him was the same one from his memories. He couldn't ignore the strange coincidence, nor explain how it had ended up on this child's hand. His entire body tightened, as if each joint had been twisted and locked. Mira leaned down again, tightened the wrench once more, the steel flashing, this time joined by the glint of the ring. She worked silently, letting the ridicule rain down without pause. Victor couldn't take his eyes off her hand. Every turn of the bolt felt like more than a repair. It was drilling into his memory, into secrets long buried. The highway sank into darkness. The wind howled, and dust swirled. The laughter of the cops now sounded like the screeches of bats. Hollow, disturbing. In Victor's mind, only two images remained. Mira, with the blazing ring, and the figure of the woman he once loved. Shattered fragments of memory knocked against the walls of his mind, threatening to shatter the cold shell he had built around himself. He stood there, silent, but his eyes betrayed him. Doubt had transformed into something more intense. Raw, chaotic uncertainty. Part of him wanted to deny it all, to believe the cops and call it a scam, but another part screamed that the truth was right in front of him. He clenched his fists so hard his nails dug into his skin, breath quickening. Mira looked up again, directly at him. There was no pleading in her eyes, no fear, only something deeper, like a challenge, daring him to remember, to really see, to recognize the truth he had tried to bury. Victor felt his heart pounding, each beat like a blow, leaving him dizzy. The ring still burned bright on Mira's finger, a reminder that refused to fade. Faced with it, Victor Hayes, a man who once believed he controlled the world, was pulled into a storm of memory, family secrets, loss, wounds that had never healed. And he understood, this moment was a turning point. He couldn't walk away, he couldn't pretend. The question, "Where did that ring come from?" would haunt him until he found the answer. And the ring on Mira's hand would be the key to unlocking the truth he had feared for so many years. The wind howled across the empty highway, kicking up waves of dust that made the red-streaked sunset sky feel even more suffocating. Mira stayed bent under the hood, her small hands gripping the wrench, sweat and dirt streaking her cheeks. The cops watched her with sneering eyes, their mockery growing more obvious. One of them stepped forward without warning and slammed his muscled arm into Mira's shoulder. The rough shove knocked her thin body to the pavement, her knee scraping against the coarse asphalt, drawing blood. His voice cut through the wind, cruel as a blade. "You're just a little black rat." Victor erupted. Blood rushed to his face and he stepped forward, no longer holding back. His voice roared, hoarse but thunderous. "Touch her again, and I'll sue you into the ground." He was no longer the quiet man observing, no longer keeping distance from trouble. Now he had stepped into the fire. His outburst made the two officers pause for a beat, but only a beat. One lunged forward and grabbed Victor's arm, squeezing so hard the joints cracked. The man leaned in, his breath hot at Victor's ear, voice low and venomous, each word like a needle piercing flesh. "Your money buys you stocks, not our law." Victor gasped, chest tight, his eyes blazing. Never in his life had power and money felt so worthless. All those years as a millionaire, making people bow with a single word. And now, in front of these uniformed men, his threats meant nothing. The brutal truth landed like a slap, choking him, yet only fueling the fury building inside. On the scorching pavement, Mira pushed herself upright. Blood trickled from her knee, her hands covered in dust and grease, but her eyes still burned. She didn't retreat. She didn't run. She faced the two men towering over Victor, and her voice rang out, sharp and blazing, louder than the screaming wind. "You don't deserve that uniform!" The shout burst from her small chest and echoed, freezing the two officers in place. Victor was stunned. He turned, eyes wide, staring at Mira. He couldn't believe a child just thrown to the ground could still rise and scream at men 100 times more powerful than her. That voice, that defiance, felt like lightning tearing through the sky. Mira wasn't just fixing a car, she was repairing the warped truth about power itself, proving that courage isn't measured by body, money, or metal, but by the strength to rise after being crushed. The officer holding Victor let out a dry laugh, but it sounded forced. He turned to Mira, lips curling. "You've got guts, kid. Thinking your words actually matter." He tightened his grip on Victor's arm, trying to assert full control, but Mira's eyes didn't flinch. She repeated herself, this time slower, clearer. "You don't deserve that uniform." Victor gasped for breath, but something strange ignited inside him. He was used to negotiations where everything was weighed by profit. But in that moment, hearing Mira shout, he realized there was something stronger than any contract, unfiltered truth. And that truth, spoken by a child, was enough to shake those who claimed to uphold the law. The vast highway darkened into twilight, wind still whipping over the sand and dust. But the space around the smoking Mustang had transformed into a battlefield, where a child with grease-stained hands stood against men wrapped in power. In Victor's eyes, Mira was no longer just a stray girl. She was a symbol of what he had once lost: the courage to stand tall, no matter the cost. The officer finally released Victor, shoving him back with a sneer and blowing cigarette smoke into the air. He spat on the ground, voice threatening. "You think you've won something? This is just the beginning. You and that girl are going to pay." His words dragged out, dark and heavy, like a sentence not just for Mira, but for Victor as well. But when he looked up, his gaze met Mira's fiery stare, and in an instant, that smug grin vanished. Victor felt it clearly. Something had changed. Not out in the world, but inside himself. A man who had once stood at the top of power now saw that the real force pushing back against open abuse wasn't lawsuits or legal threats, but the unshakable spirit burning inside a child. He looked at Mira, and for the first time, realized he was learning something from a gaze fiercer than anything he had ever known. The highway fell silent again, only the wind brushing against the worn-out body of the Mustang. But inside Victor, a storm had begun, roaring, relentless, because he knew with certainty nothing would ever be the same. The desert wind cut sharply across the broken asphalt, carrying thick waves of dust that blurred the cracked stretch of road. The Mustang lay still, faint smoke rising from the engine bay, the burnt scent of metal mixing with the cigarette stench from the officers' breaths. Victor Hayes stood upright, chest heaving, eyes bloodshot after being pinned and shoved. He hadn't regained his composure when one of the officers reached into his coat, yanked out his wallet, then tore the leather folder that held the car documents he had always kept carefully tucked away. "Let's see if Big Man Hayes is as clean as he looks." the cop sneered, ripping the cover open and flipping through the pages with deliberate slowness, flaunting his power. Victor roared, "That's personal property! Give it back now!" But his voice was drowned by the booming laugh of the other officer. He spat on the pavement, his gravelly voice echoing, "Rich, but still just a fat target. Don't think that stack of paper's gonna save you." Victor clenched his fists, joints popping, veins bulging at his temples. He was used to being welcomed in any room, used to his signature making people tremble, but now, as these men in uniforms meant to protect justice, acted like thugs, all that power slipped away like sand through his fingers. He felt humiliated, furious, but most of all, helpless, facing something he had never imagined, unchecked abuse of authority. Mira stepped closer, her small, bloodied hand still gripping her tool bag. She leaned in slightly, whispered into his ear, her voice low but heavy as stone. "This is our everyday life." The words chilled Victor. They weren't loud, not a rallying cry, but they opened a window into a world he'd never stepped into, a world where small people were stopped, searched, stepped on just because of their skin or their weakness. He turned to look at Mira, and in her deep black eyes, he didn't see fear, only familiarity. Like this scene had played out so many times, it no longer shocked her. Victor's throat closed. It was dry, choked. Every word he wanted to speak caught halfway up. He wanted to scream this was wrong, to throw his name at them like a weapon, but his chest tightened, because for the first time in his life, he felt like the powerless one. The people he'd only read about in news stories filled with words like injustice and oppression, words he never really believed. The officers didn't stop at the documents. One of them flung the registration into the air and let it fall to the ground, stomping on it, grinding his heel into it like he meant to crush it into dust. The other flipped through Victor's wallet, eyeing each bank card, then let out a mocking laugh. "All those numbers mean nothing when you're standing in front of us." His voice rang out sharp, each word landing like a hammer, pounding deeper into the helplessness Victor now carried. Victor tried to yank his arm back, but was immediately stopped by a sharp shove to the shoulder that sent him stumbling several steps, nearly falling. Dust swirled thick around him, clinging to his expensive coat, turning the image of a powerful millionaire into someone humiliated in the middle of the desert. He bent down, picking up the now dirty documents with shaking hands, trembling with both anger and shame. His heart pounded wildly. For the first time in years, he felt forced down, no longer the one in control. Mira stood close beside him, her small hand resting lightly on his arm, as if to steady him from falling. Victor glanced down and saw the child's eyes glowing in the dark, saw the blood smeared across her knee, yet her gaze remained unshaken. He swallowed hard, unsure what to say. In that moment, he realized he looked no different now from the people he had once dismissed, once believed were weak, once thought injustice was just a blown-up story. He felt it in his throat. The truth now hit him too hard to deny. The wind picked up, howling through brittle weed, scattering loose pages into the air. One registration slip flew far, and Mira rushed after it, her dirty hands gently retrieving it and handing it back to Victor. He took it, eyes glassy, struck by the strange feeling that it was he who had been saved, not the Mustang. Mira's words echoed again in his mind. "This is our everyday life." That word, every day, fell like lead, leaving Victor reeling. For him, this was an unacceptable nightmare. For Mira, it was a rhythm so constant it no longer startled her. The officers watched and sneered. One of them barked out loud, "Look at you two, the big shot and the filthy brat. Same trash under our boots." The words made Victor shiver, but also forced him to see more clearly. He turned, eyes blazing with fury, but deep within, something else flickered. A spark of resolve. He couldn't let this continue. He couldn't stand by while a child was trampled. But before he could act, he knew full well that his power meant nothing here. Not on this road, not in this twilight, not under the fists of those who saw him as a toy to be broken. Mira still stood tall, chest rising and falling, but her voice was steady. She looked at the two officers, lips cracked and bloodied, but her eyes proud. She whispered again, this time not only to Victor, but straight at them. "You have power, but not reason." Her voice carried in the wind, sending a chill down Victor's spine. He swallowed the lump in his throat, realizing that for the first time, he was standing on the other side. The side of those who had no choices left. Powerlessness wrapped around him, but it also revealed a truth. If he, with all his money and reputation, could be trampled this easily, then what had people like Mira, those with nothing but their hands and grit, been forced to endure their entire lives? Victor Hayes, the man who once believed the world rested in his palm, now stood on a desolate highway and saw that his power had cracked. A deep fracture had opened. Through it, he saw the truth he had long chosen to ignore. As the sun set, the last light of day cast a fiery red glow across the road, reflecting off the glossy black paint of the Mustang lying still by the roadside like a wounded beast. Victor stood there, his eyes weary and helpless, while the two police officers kept their arms crossed, smirking and tossing out the occasional sneer. But Mira paid no mind to their mockery. Her small but steady hands worked swiftly, turning each bolt with movements so sharp and precise that Victor held his breath watching her. Sweat trickled down her cheek, and the sunset light gave her face a strange kind of pride, as if she were born to take on challenges like this. At last, Mira grabbed the keys, her eyes shining with complete confidence. She got into the driver's seat, gripped the wheel tightly, and calmly turned the ignition. A moment of silence fell over them. Victor and the two officers stared ahead, waiting for either a miracle or a collapse. Then, cutting through that silence, the engine suddenly roared to life, low, deep, and powerful, like the roar of a beast awakened from a long sleep. The sound echoed down the road, bounced off concrete walls, and rang in everyone's ears, even startling the birds on the power lines into flight. Victor stood frozen, his heart pounding as if trying to match the rhythm of the engine. Moments before, he had nearly given up, thinking the legendary car he had clung to for so many years was beyond saving on this dusty road. Yet this girl, with her tangled hair and grease-stained hands, had done what he thought was impossible. He took a step forward, his eyes lit up, and he blurted out, "That girl, she saved both me and the car." His voice was hoarse, but it carried a raw emotion he hadn't expected to show in front of the two men who were used to looking at him with arrogance. The two officers stood in stunned silence, their faces visibly shaken. The smug grins were gone, replaced by confusion, maybe even a hint of panic. From the start, they had seen this as a chance to humiliate Vic, to turn a millionaire and his luxury car into a roadside joke. But that roar had flipped the whole script, turning their mockery into a silent witness of a quiet triumph they couldn't touch. The words they had just sneered out now slapped back at their own pride. Victor turned to look at Mira, his eyes lit up with a mix of astonishment and respect. He was used to seeing people from lower classes as passing shadows, not worth his attention, but now he realized he was standing before a girl unlike any he had known, someone who carried a strength money couldn't buy. Mira gently set the wrench down on the pavement, the metallic clink dry and firm. She stood up, wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, then leaned in and whispered, her voice low and steady, "You haven't seen anything yet." The words passed quickly, but they sent a strange chill down Victor's spine. It didn't sound like boasting. It felt like a promise, like a door opening to things he had never imagined. His eyes paused on Mira's hand as she raised it to brush her hair back, and a small silver ring caught the sunset light. The reflection made it shine like a tiny flame, and in that moment, Victor suddenly understood that in front of him was not just a girl who could fix cars, but a soul carrying a fire that was only beginning to burn. Wind swept through, stirring dust around their feet, the Mustang's engine still roaring, its pulse shaking the road beneath them. Victor took a few steps back, his eyes still locked on Mira. He saw her figure standing there, small but unshaken, as if she, not the car, was what had truly come back to life. He thought of all the engineers, racers, and loudmouths he had met, all the ones who bragged about their skill, yet none had ever left him speechless like this. Mira, with her grease-streaked hands, had made the impossible real, and somehow, she had stirred a heart long hardened by shallow parties and hollow victory. The two police officers could now only glance at each other, confusion written plainly on their faces. One tried to recover his cold tone, but the words caught in his throat. Everything they had just seen was enough for the distant crowd, once quietly observing, to start murmuring among themselves. Some nodded in admiration, and a few smiled faintly in Mira's direction. The entire mood had shifted, no longer ruled by hollow authority, but filled with the quiet spread of respect for a girl who dared to stand in the fading light and prove what she could do. Victor stepped closer, his voice soft but full of emotion. "You know, I've seen a lot in my life, but maybe this is the one sight I'll remember most." Mira didn't answer. She only smiled, a tired but confident smile, her eyes gazing off toward the end of the road, as if already waiting for the next challenge. The ring on her hand glinted once more, catching the last of the sunlight before it sank behind the row of worn-down buildings, leaving the sky burning red. The roar of the Mustang's engine echoed through the air like a declaration of revival, not just of the car, but of Victor's faith itself. He stood there, surrounded by dust and the thunder of machinery, realizing that the values he had once clung to, wealth, power, pride, suddenly felt small in the face of a young girl's hand. Mira had opened a new perspective for him, a reminder that true strength doesn't lie in social status, but in skill and the will to never back down. And as twilight gave way to darkness, The last light lingered on the silver ring on Mira's hand, casting a quiet glow across her face that made it shine with something hard to define. Victor knew this meeting wasn't a chance. It felt like a piece of music composed by fate, beginning with the roar of an engine in the fading day, signaling that a new chapter was about to begin, not just for the Mustang, but for his own life. The Mustang's engine still echoed down the highway, its powerful hum turning the heavy atmosphere oddly silent. The two officers had stepped back a few paces, but their eyes remained threatening, refusing to leave. Victor stood beside the car, his face still etched with tension, hands trembling slightly from both anger and confusion. Mira, after setting the wrench down, quietly stepped closer to him, her eyes sharp with determination, but her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Take this." In her hand was a folded piece of paper, its edges worn and ink smudged with sweat, clearly kept safe for a long time. Victor frowned slightly, eyes lowering to the paper in her small hand, feeling both doubt and urgency. He took it slowly, slipping it into his palm with such subtlety that the officers didn't notice. Mira glanced sideways, her look a silent reminder to keep quiet, then turned and pretended to crouch over her tool bag. Her movement was swift, precise, like she had rehearsed it, without hesitation. One of the officers stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the pavement in the dying twilight. He looked straight at Victor, eyes narrowed, the mockery replaced now with a colder edge. "Next time, we won't be so forgiving." His voice cut like a blade, each word landing hard on the dry asphalt. A simple threat, but enough to send a chill through Victor's spine. He tapped his fingers on the grip of his gun, then turned to Mira with a crooked smirk. "Watch that little mouth of yours, kid." Victor tightened his grip around the paper, his heart pounding. He wanted to ask Mira right away where that address led, why she was giving it to him, but he knew this wasn't the time. Even though the air had settled after the Mustang roared back to life, the tension still hung above them like a blade. The two officers backed toward their patrol car, but their eyes still burned with warning. They said nothing more, but the weight of their footsteps as they left told Victor this fight was far from over. Mira zipped up her tool bag, shoulders twitching slightly, but her eyes never left the patrol car as it faded into the distance. She took a deep breath, then whispered almost soundlessly, "Don't open it here." Victor heard her clearly, gave a slight nod, and tucked the paper into the inner pocket of his coat. He could feel the fabric there heating up, as if that small note held a fire capable of burning through every truth he hadn't yet dared to face. The Mustang rumbled soft, its engine now steady, but Victor's mind was anything but calm. He slid into the driver's seat, one hand on the wheel, still trembling. Mira sat beside him, small and silent, yet her gaze held not only resolve, but also something secretive. Victor glanced over and saw that she wasn't afraid after everything, but instead seemed to accept threats as a normal part of life. He swallowed hard, feeling both admiration and concern, because he understood now that his life was about to be pulled into a storm Mira had lived in for a long time. The highway thinned out, darkness falling fast, headlights stretching into twin beams on the cracked road ahead. Victor drove on, his mind a tangle, his palm still tingling from the folded paper. He knew, whether he wanted to or not, that the address would be an answer, and possibly a door to something he had never dared imagine. Beside him, Mira remained quiet, eyes on the window, watching the fading glow of passing signs, but her small hand rested firmly on the tool bag, gripping it as if ready for whatever might come next. Victor glanced at her, saying nothing, but a certainty settled deep inside him. This journey wasn't about reaching a destination, but the beginning of an entirely new path. The paper in his pocket was a map to the truth, and Mira was the only key that could unlock it. Victor leaned toward the window, his voice rough but each word landing like a hammer on the dusty road. "I won't forget your faces." The two officers hesitated for a beat, then smiled, that same crooked grin full of contempt and challenge. They knew his threat would be hard to fulfill, because in their hands was an entire system of power, and no matter how wealthy Victor was, he stood on ground where laws bent under the weight of uniforms. But in that moment, as he turned with burning eyes, Victor felt a rage boil over inside him. He was no longer a passive observer, but a man pulled into a fight he could no longer walk away from. The Mustang shuddered slightly, its engine smooth beneath Mira's touch. Victor twisted the wheel and the car surged forward, leaving behind two silhouettes watching with venom in their eyes. In the rearview mirror, their forms grew smaller, but Victor knew the threat hadn't vanished with distance. He gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles white, his mind echoing with that bitter laugh. Even as they drove away, it felt like someone was still whispering near his ear, reminding him that retaliation was coming, and it was only a matter of time. In the passenger seat, Mira sat still, her small frame swallowed by the darkness of the car's interior. She said nothing, but her thin hands were tightly clasped together. On her finger, the ring caught the glow of the headlights, flickering like a tiny flame trapped in a cage. Victor glanced over, saw her lips pressed into a firm line, her eyes locked on the night outside the window, where the road stretched endlessly forward. He realized Mira was holding back every emotion, hiding both fear and pride in a single gesture, gripping the ring. Victor drew a deep breath, trying to refocus on the road ahead. For the first time, he was no longer sure he was in control. His entire life had been about holding power, giving orders, and making decisions. But now, inside the cramped Mustang, he felt like a man unmoored. The folded paper in his pocket burned against his chest, and Mira's silence felt heavier than any spoken word. He turned to say something, but met the girl's resolute gaze, a look that made him fall silent, as if she already knew every question he wanted to ask, but wasn't ready to answer. The tires scraped over the dry pavement, dragging into a steady rhythm, but in Victor's chest, each sound echoed like a drumbeat. He looked at Mira again and saw her small hand tremble, yet still clutching the ring. A vague feeling crept in, like he was sitting beside a secret too big to speak aloud, too fragile to be exposed. Mira stayed quiet, but that silence thundered in his mind, a reminder that what lay ahead wasn't just a destination, but a door opening into truth he'd never dared to consider. The Mustang sped through the night, leaving behind the scent of oil and the lingering weight of unspoken threats. Inside the car, there was only Victor, simmering with unresolved rage, and Mira, her ring blazing against her skin. Both of them swept into a journey they knew, once begun, could not be turned back. Mira's old car rolled over the uneven roads, leaving behind the glittering lights of the city center. The night sky was a dull gray, and the streetlights cast a faint yellow glow, reflecting off puddles filled with trash. Victor sat beside her, gripping the edge of the seat, his eyes wide as the scene before him came into focus. He had never imagined a place could be this bleak, only a few miles from the city's heart, yet it felt like another world. Rows of crowded houses stood close together, their cracked walls and rusted tin roofs barely holding together, windows shattered and patched with old plastic. The muddy road was strewn with garbage, the air thick with the stench of mold and burning waste. Barefoot children ran through narrow alleys, their curious eyes fixed on the unfamiliar car that had just arrived. Victor was stunned, as if slapped across the face. Echoes of lavish parties with wine and crystal lights still rang in his mind, but now they only made this scene more bitter. He turned to Mira, but the young woman drove on calmly, her face steady, as if all of this was nothing new. When the car stopped at an empty lot, Mira turned off the engine and pointed ahead. "This is where I grew up, and where the police treat it like their dumping ground." Her words rang out, steady and clear, but each one dropped into Victor's chest like lead. They began walking into the neighborhood. Mira led him through cramped alleys where the roofs nearly scraped their heads. Loud music blared from a nearby house, mixed with the dry cough of an old man. Victor looked around, aware of every eye on them, some wary, others simply tired. Mira didn't slow down, pointing to each roof as they passed. This house, the police stormed in at midnight and beat a boy just because they thought he stole something. That family, their father was taken without a warrant. No one knows if he's still alive. Her voice was flat, but the more Victor listened, the more he heard the quiet weight of pain beneath it. They passed a crumbling shack with an old worn shirt hanging outside. Mira lowered her voice slightly. The man who lived here was a mechanic. He got into an argument with a cop and ended up in jail for 6 months. Lost his job. His family nearly fell apart. His daughter had to drop out of school to work. Victor slowed his pace, his eyes lingering on a thin girl curled up by the doorway, her stare hollow. His chest tightened, a deep, unfamiliar shame rising in him. He remembered the times he had ignored cries for help, brushing them off as not his concern. Mira kept walking, her steps firm. She stopped in front of a brick house with stained walls and a wooden door hanging off its hinges. "This family used to be our neighbors. My mother witnessed the man of the house being dragged away just because he refused to bow to a senseless order. He never came back." Her voice wavered slightly, but her eyes stayed sharp. Victor looked at her and realized that behind that strong exterior was a sky full of scars and memories. The deeper they went, the clearer the brutal contrast became between the world Victor had known and this one. Every home Mira pointed to carried a grim story, a trace of oppression. The dark alleys, the cautious stares, the tired sighs, all painted a picture he had never known existed. This truth wasn't printed in newspapers or whispered in rumors. It was laid bare in front of him, so real it left him speechless. Victor paused as he saw a group of children laughing while kicking around a worn-out ball, but the moment it rolled near 2 plainclothes officers standing at the end of the alley, their laughter died, replaced by fear. He followed their gaze, then turned to Mira. She said softly, "That's the truth. Around here, the police aren't here to protect. They're here to control. and everyone, old or young, knows it. In that moment, Victor felt a heaviness settle in his chest. He was no longer a comfortable businessman on a casual visit, but an unwilling witness to the injustice Mira had laid bare. Every story she told felt like a cut against the indifference he had carried for so many years. His steps grew heavier, but he kept following her, because he knew the only way to truly grasp the value of truth and the strength that Naomi and Mira were holding on to was to face this darkness head-on. The children in the slum stopped playing as Victor and Mira walked past the narrow alley. Their eyes, instead of bright with innocence like the children Victor was used to seeing in well-off families, were sharp with an eerie wariness. A boy around 10 clutched the ragged ball in his hand, his bare feet caked in mud, his dark eyes tracking Victor's every move as if he were an intruder. A younger girl with messy hair clung tightly to her brother, hiding behind a cloth hanging over the door. That guarded look wasn't just childish instinct. It was etched deep from experiences they should never have had to endure. Victor slowed down, not wanting to scare them, but their wary stares pressed on his chest like a weight, as if he embodied the world that had turned its back on them. He tried to smile, a gentle smile he once believed could bridge any gap, but the children didn't respond. They avoided his gaze, stepped back, their eyes still full of suspicion. Victor saw the contrast clearly. On the wealthy streets where he lived, children would usually run up to strangers, eager for candy or compliments. But here, wariness was like armor they were forced to wear before they even understood what fear meant. Mira stood beside him and sighed softly, her eyes drifting across the young faces before landing on Victor. She said nothing, but the message was unmistakable. He was standing in a world where childhood smiles had been stolen. They kept walking, but Victor couldn't take his eyes off the children. He heard them whisper to one another, their voices shaky, as if any sound might invite trouble. On the sidewalk, a few sat on broken wooden crates, their thin legs swinging, their eyes scanning him with quiet caution. One boy raised a finger to his lips, signaling silence when he spotted a police officer passing by at the end of the alley. The gesture so practiced it sent a chill through Victor. In that moment, he realized fear had become routine, embedded in their every move like breathing, like instinct. Victor suddenly thought of his own daughter. Back home, she once burst into tears just because another child took her toy, a sadness he quickly soothed with a piece of candy. He had never imagined that children the same age could be living under constant watch, too afraid to laugh out loud, too afraid to run freely, always alert to the presence of a blue uniform. The thought hit him like a blow, as if a thick curtain in his mind had just been torn open. Mira kept pointing out rooftops, telling the stories behind each warped wall. Victor listened, but his thoughts kept circling back to the wary children. He began to grasp the raw truth. The world he had known was only a small, polished corner of a much larger picture. Here, in the slums, was another reality altogether, where people lived in the shadows of oppression and neglect. He could now see what the news often skimmed over in a few cold sentences, but standing in front of it, the weight was 1,000 times heavier. The houses Mira pointed to were no longer just poor structures. They were markers of tragedy. Each brick, each sagging door reminded him of a family crushed by power and injustice. Victor realized that in his luxurious mansion, he had never once needed to think about places like this. To him, they were just gray smudges on a map, beyond the borders of his concern. But now, with children's wary eyes staring back at him, with Mira's stories cutting into his conscience, he understood he had lived too long in deliberate blindness. They walked down a narrow street, lined with rickety wooden houses on both sides. The sharp stench of burning garbage crept into Victor's nose, making him wince. A group of children sat huddled together, hugging their knees, their eyes sunken like black holes. They didn't scream or rush to see the unfamiliar car. They just stared, their gaze seeming to ask, "What will you do to us?" Victor slowed his pace, his heart tightening. He had no answer, and that was the deepest pain of all. When Mira turned to him, she said quietly, "You see, here, children grow up on fear. They learn silence before they learn to read. They learn to avoid a cop's eyes before they learn to tie their shoes." Victor didn't respond, his throat closing. Her words pulled back every image they had just witnessed, and he felt part of himself begin to break. He realized he had never known this world, never set foot in it, never cared, as if it didn't exist. But clearly it did, right in front of him, undeniable and immovable. As they stepped out of the dark alley, Victor looked up at the night sky, where faint stars were hidden behind layers of smoke and dust. He saw the contradiction too clearly. In the city center, glass towers lit up the sky like they owned it, while here, even the dim glow of a few streetlights couldn't cut through the darkness. That parallel world had always existed beside him, but for years he had chosen not to see it. Now, facing it, he felt guilt and awakening all at once. A flood of questions rushed through Victor's mind. He wondered how many years he had unknowingly helped maintain this injustice through his indifference, through a life centered only on personal gain. He asked himself why those children had to bear the consequences of a broken system, while his own child grew up in safety, and he knew, even without immediate answers, that he could no longer turn away as he had before. When they stopped at a small courtyard, where a few children were scribbling on the wall with pieces of burned charcoal, Victor stood silently, watching. In the clumsy drawings were homes with glowing windows, the shapes of smiling people inside. That innocent sketch, made in a slum full of shadows, showed him the simple longing every human deserves, a life that feels safe, without fear. Victor realized the world he had never known was no longer a distant thing. It had touched him, seeped into his thoughts, settled like a weight on his heart, and in that stunned clarity he understood he had passed through a door he could never return from. Those cautious eyes of the children would haunt him, but they would also serve as a reminder to live differently, to stop being the man who stood outside someone else's pain. The light reflecting off the ring on Mira's hand struck Victor's eyes like a blade, forcing him to look deeper, not just into the present, but into the shadows of the past. He sat silently in the car, both hands resting on the steering wheel, but slightly trembling, and the image in the rearview mirror blurred, giving way to a flood of memories. He saw another pair of hands, slender and soft, once wearing that same ring. It was Elena, the woman who had entered his life unexpectedly and disappeared like the wind. Elena was unlike anyone he had ever met, her deep black eyes always holding a light that made Victor believe the world was more than cold transactions and empty parties. He remembered the first time they met, in a small bookstore in Brooklyn, when he was still a young man just entering the business world, not yet burdened by corporate empire. Elena wore a simple dress, her hair tied neatly behind her head, arms full of books on philosophy and sociology. They exchanged a few words, and the conversation stretched into hours. To Elena, every issue could be seen from a human perspective, while for Victor at the time, everything revolved around profit. She made him realize there was a world beyond numbers and spreadsheets. They began seeing each other more often, walking through parks, sipping sidewalk coffee, talking about dreams and fears. Always, Elena insisted that the greatest strength a person had was not wealth, dignity. That love blossomed quickly but was surrounded from the start by fierce opposition. Victor's family, part of the upper class, never accepted the idea of a woman of color entering their lives. His stern father once threw a photo of the couple to the floor, shouting that he was destroying the family's honor. His mother wept, not out of sympathy for her son, but from fear over the reputation and connections that tied the family to high society. They used every tact, pleas, pressure, threats, just to force Victor away from Elena. Victor, still too young then to stand against the system that raised him, gave in to that pressure. He continued to see Elena, but each meeting became more difficult, each word of love more overshadowed by his family's threats. Elena understood it all. She never blamed him, only quietly squeezed his hand and said love could not survive if forced to bow its head. One rainy afternoon, under the awning of an old building, Elena returned the scarf he once gave her, her eyes bright yet proud, and whispered, "If you cannot walk through that wall, I will leave." And then she was gone, like a painful but resolute promise. Victor searched, but it was in vain. The streets where they once strolled no longer held any trace of her. The familiar cafes no longer had the woman reading quietly in the corner. Everything felt as if it had never existed, except for the ring he clearly remembered Elena wearing, a symbol of pride and the love they once shared. His family saw her disappearance as a victory, but to Victor, it was a wound that never healed. He buried himself in work, building a financial empire as a way to fill the void. But the more he succeeded, the heavier the guilt became. Now, seeing that same ring on Mira's hand, everything returned, flooding into the cracks of his soul. Victor gripped the steering wheel, his breath quickening, wondering if the child's appearance was fate dragging him back to face the truth he once ran from. Elena was gone, but the ring remained, worn by a stranger's child, and that made it impossible for him to keep lying to himself. He knew this truth would lead him further, into a place where power and wealth could no longer protect him, into the memories he had buried beneath the glitter of a successful but empty life. The question pierced Victor's mind like a blade straight to the chest. Mira, could she be? He didn't dare say it aloud, because in that moment, language felt too fragile to touch the truth. Since seeing the ring, memories of Elena had rushed back, and when he looked into Mira's bright eyes, he saw a light so familiar it was chilling. Those eyes held the same depth as Elena's, a gaze that seemed to pierce through, both gentle and fierce, as if carrying a bloodline he could not deny. Victor turned away, his hand tightening around the wheel, trembling beyond control. His heart pounded wildly, each beat threatening to shatter his chest. and all he could feel was his blood reacting to a truth his mind still refused to admit. The road ahead stretched endlessly, Mustang headlights slicing through the darkness, casting shadows on crumbling houses. Victor kept driving, but his mind was elsewhere, drifting in the space between past and present. Beside him, Mira sat silently, clutching the ring like a precious relic. She didn't know that every small movement was striking Victor's heart, awakening a longing both sacred and terrifying. He wanted to ask her everything, wanted to know who her father was, wanted to know how Elena had lived after leaving him, wanted to know if her departure had been to protect the small life now sitting beside him. But Victor couldn't speak, because to say it would be to tear down every wall and let the truth devour him. He remembered those final days with Elena, the memory of the tear she held back as she walked away, the proud look in her eyes when she said that love could not be controlled by others. If Elena had disappeared while carrying a piece of his own flesh and blood, then Mira was the answer he never had the courage to face. The thought sent a chill down his spine, his hands soaked in sweat. Every time he glanced at Mira, he caught a glimpse of the past in her eyes, as if time had bound 2 generations together with a thread he once deliberately cut. Mira said nothing, but her silence felt like a quiet confirmation. Victor listened to the rhythm of her breathing, her small shoulders gently rising and falling, and he found himself trembling along with her. He thought of all the long nights he tried to fill the void Elena left with contracts, numbers, and investments. But it was never enough. Now, that emptiness was being filled by a truth even more terrifying. The void was never his alone to bear, but also Mira's, a child who might carry his blood, whose entire childhood he had missed. Victor turned, his eyes resting on Mira's hand, where the ring gleamed every time the streetlight hit it. He swallowed hard, wanting to reach out and touch it, but pulled back, knowing it was no longer just a piece of jewelry, but a thread connecting past and present, a relic of a love torn apart, and a story never told. In that moment, all he could hear was the frantic pounding in his chest, the trembling beat of blood reminding him that truth, no matter how painful, could not be avoided forever. The dark night cloaked the road ahead, yet Victor saw more clearly than ever the picture in his heart. He didn't dare believe it, didn't dare speak it, but his whole body burned as if fire was rising from within. Every look from Mira, every small gesture, felt like a silent answer to the question that pierced his chest. And Victor knew, even if he tried to deny it, the truth had already begun to stir in his very flesh, leaving him no escape. The poor neighborhood lay shrouded in night, the weak streetlights unable to chase away the gloom. From afar came the rumble of heavy engines, red and blue lights flashing along cracked walls, reflecting off shattered windows. Victor sat in the car, watching the scene with a heavy gaze. He hadn't had a chance to say anything after seeing the wariness in the children's eyes when the atmosphere shifted. At the end of the alley, a police car stopped, and 2 large figures stepped out, leaning against the door, their eyes scanning the row of houses like predators tracking prey. Another vehicle rolled up slowly, its headlights sweeping across a small courtyard where a few families had gathered, causing everyone to fall silent and retreat into the shadows. Victor could feel the suffocating tension. He was once used to police cars gliding past as symbols of safety, but here, they appeared like specters, a constant reminder that oppression always lurked just outside the door. Wooden doors creaked shut, hurried footsteps echoed, and life in the neighborhood shrank back within a few breaths. Mira stood beside him, her eyes showing no fear, only a cold, sharp clarity. She stared straight at the officers, then turned to Victor, her voice low but firm. "They want to silence every voice." Victor turned to her, his breath caught in his throat. The sentence was brief, but carried more weight than 1,000 explanations. He looked around and saw how everyone here had long grown accustomed to this scene. Children huddled in the dark, mothers clutched their babies, men stood silently behind thin curtains, their eyes flickering with anger and helplessness. Victor realized, for them, the police were not protectors, but a constant threat. Mira took a step forward, her hand tightening slightly, the ring flashing in the flickering light. Victor realized she wasn't just speaking to him, but wanted him to witness this firsthand, to feel the fear and frustration of a community held under pressure. He could see the glances peeking through windows, eyes silently asking if he would stand with them or turn away like so many others in power. His heart grew heavy, his stomach twisted with an unfamiliar feeling, part shame, part urgency. The police car at the end of the alley blared its siren, the piercing sound shaking the entire block. The 2 uniformed men moved in deeper, shining flashlights through every crack in the door, searching as if hunting for criminals. One of them sneered, his voice echoing, "Get to sleep early, or you'll be our problem tomorrow." His laughter mixed with the wind, sending a chill through the air. Victor saw a small boy in the courtyard, trembling so hard he dropped the rusty can he was holding, the sharp clang drawing the officer's flashlight instantly. The boy scrambled behind his mother, who pulled him close, her face lowered to the ground. Victor wanted to step out, wanted to say something, but Mira placed a hand on his arm and shook her head gently. She whispered, her eyes still locked on the dark figures sweeping the neighborhood with their flashlights. "This happens every night. The more you speak up now, the more excuses they'll have to crack down. We live in the dark because they don't allow light to exist." Her voice was sharp and cold, not filled with fear, only truth. Victor listened and his chest tightened because he knew she was right. The police car turned around, headlights sweeping one last time before slowly backing out of the neighborhood. The sound of the engine faded, leaving behind a heavy silence. People cautiously stepped out from hiding, hushed murmurs rising and falling again quickly, as if fear had seeped into their blood, becoming a habit. Victor slumped back into his seat, cold sweat trickling down his spine, Mira's words echoing in his mind. He realized his presence had changed nothing in that moment, but the truth he had just witnessed was now etched into him. Mira stepped out of the car, took a deep breath, and then turned to face him. Her eyes glowed in the dark, her voice steady. "You saw it. We don't need pity. We need people willing to stand with us. If you really want to understand, be ready for the worst." Victor didn't reply, only stared into those eyes where he saw the same unyielding fire he had once seen in Elena's. He understood this was no longer about fixing a car or solving a problem, but a path forced him to choose: remain a bystander or step into the darkness to face those trying to silence every voice. Victor shouted, his voice echoing down the dark alley. "It can't be like this!" The words burst out as a reflex, a desperate attempt to push back against the truth crushing his chest. He looked around and saw the sagging rooftops, the eyes that had just closed behind doors in fear, the children too afraid to laugh out loud because of the police siren. In Victor's world, that was disgraceful, a tragedy beyond comprehension. But here, right now, it existed like breath, like a part of life people were forced to endure. He trembled, fists clenched, his eyes bloodshot with rage and helplessness. Mira stood there still, small in frame but unwavering in her gaze, watching him with an odd calm. She tilted her head slightly, a sad smile forming at the corner of her lips, a smile filled more with endurance than peace. "For us, that's normal." Her words carried no resentment, no outcry, but they pierced straight into Victor's heart, leaving him reeling like he'd been struck. The word normal came out gently, but within it was an entire world forced to coexist with oppression, a world so numbed by pain it no longer recognized injustice as something unusual. Victor looked straight into Mira's eyes, the eyes of a child carrying the exhaustion of an entire generation. He saw Elena in them, the same unwavering light, the same strength that didn't need to shout to prove itself. Mira's answer silenced him because he realized that all his outrage had only scratched the surface, while for the people here, outrage had already hardened into daily existence. He sat quietly on the worn steps of a house, head bowed, breathing deeply to steady the tremble in his chest. The sound of children's footsteps echoed in the alley. They clung to each other, eyeing him warily. Victor suddenly felt lost in the very city that had built his name. He once believed power meant freedom, but now he understood that power could just as easily become an excuse for oppression, and those with nothing were the ground onto which that power was poured. Mira didn't need to explain further. Her calm alone was enough for Victor to see how stark the divide between their worlds really was. He lifted his head, his eyes searching for resistance. But when he saw Mira still standing there, thin-shouldered, hands gripping her tool bag tightly, the strength in him seemed to drain away. The word normal echoed in his mind, digging deep like a nail that couldn't be pulled out. It summoned images of families being searched, children trembling in the dark, disabled men sitting still behind doors, all accepting it as the rhythm of life, a brutal rule no one had the strength left to fight. Victor felt the rage inside him shifting, no longer an angry shout, but a quiet, aching stillness. He looked at Mira, and in that sad smile, he saw not just acceptance, but a challenge. It was as if she were telling him that if he truly couldn't accept, then he had to change it. Because here, they had lived long enough with this so-called normal to stop hoping for help from anyone but themselves. Victor clenched his fists, his breath heavy, unsure of what he would do next. But one thing had awakened in him. He could no longer turn his back and walk away. In the cold night, distant dogs barked, the sharp smell of damp trash lingered, and every detail of this rundown neighborhood etched itself into Victor's memory like a carving that couldn't be erased. He sat there, Mira's voice repeating in his head, "For us, that's normal." And he knew that line would haunt him, because it wasn't just a child's word. It was an indictment of a society he had once stood outside of and scoffed at. Now nothing shielded him anymore. The truth had rushed in, and for the first time in his life, Victor wasn't just angry. He had to ask himself whether he had the courage to turn that normal into the past. As they turned into a deeper alley, Mira stopped in front of a small house tucked against a crumbling brick wall. The wooden door was rotting, paint peeling in large patches, and a flickering light from an oil lamp inside spilled through the cracks. Mira knocked gently, without calling out a name. The door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman, thin but with sharp, alert eyes. Her graying hair was tied in a high bun, and deep lines etched across her face spoke of years of weathering hardship. Mira spoke soft, her tone familiar. "Aunt Rosa, I brought him." The woman glanced at Victor, her eyes cautious and probing, then nodded and stepped aside to let them in. Inside the cramped room, the scent of damp wood mixed with cooking smoke. A few old, dust-covered picture frames hung on the wall. Victor sat down on a wobbly chair, a heavy feeling settling in his chest. He sensed every gaze fixed on him, from Mira to this woman. Rosa placed a hand on Mira's shoulder, then turned, her eyes locking onto Victor. Her voice was raspy but clear. "You're here because you've seen the ring on the girl's hand." Victor flinched, his hand tightening slightly, his eyes wavering. He didn't reply, but his silence confirmed more than words could. Rosa sighed, her eyes drifting into the past. From an old cabinet, she pulled out a thick envelope. She laid it on the scratched wooden table and slowly drew out a photograph. When the photo faced Victor, his heart nearly stopped. It was Elena, with her deep brown eyes, gently curled hair, and on her slender hand, the same ring gleaming under the sunlight of another time. Victor leaned forward, fingers trembling as they touched the image, his breath shattering. Elena! The name escaped like a plea, as if he'd held it caged inside his chest for far too long. Rosa wasn't surprised. She nodded slowly, her eyes heavy with sorrow. "Yes, that's my sister. And the ring you saw on Mira's hand belonged to her." Victor leaned back, his mind spinning. Fragments of memory, like shards of broken glass, sparkled through his thoughts. Elena's smile, her unfinished promises, all rushing back. He clenched his fists, a tide of guilt rising within him. Elena had vanished from his life, leaving behind a void he had buried beneath layers of power. But now, the truth was peeling it all back, layer by layer. Mira sat nearby, her eyes watching his every reaction. She didn't speak, but her gaze glimmered with curiosity and anticipation, as if she too wanted to understand why Victor trembled at the sight of that photo. Victor struggled to steady himself, breathing deeply, but couldn't hide the storm inside. He looked up at Rosa, his voice hoarse. "Why am I only learning this now? Where did Elena go?" Rosa remained silent for a moment, her eyes shifting briefly to Mira, then back to Victor, cautious. "There's much you're not ready to hear, but at least now you've seen the proof. Elena wasn't just a passing breeze in your life. And Mira, she carries something you can no longer deny." Victor slumped forward, head bowed low, his hand still resting on the photograph. In his eyes, Elena was still smiling, her lips slightly parted as if to whisper something that transcended time. He realized he had lost far more than he ever imagined. The dimly lit room in Aunt Rosa's home had become the place where truth surfaced, tearing apart the layers of disguise Victor had worn for years. He was no longer just a wealthy man who had wandered into a poor neighborhood. He was now someone forced to face pieces of a past returning to demand answers to the question he had never dared confront. Was Mira, in the end, his own flesh and blood? Victor sat frozen, his trembling hand still on the old photograph, his eyes locked on Elena's smiling face frozen in memory. The ring on her finger in the photo was now unmistakably present on Mira's hand, no longer a coincidence, but a truth too clear to deny. He looked up at Mira, her eyes shining with strength, and her small face resembled Elena's so deeply that it stabbed at his chest. A whisper escaped his lips, heavy and painful. "Mira is Elena's daughter." The air in the small room thickened, the oil lamp flickering and casting its shadows on the wall, long and distorted like scars that would never fade. Mira paused slightly, as if she had long grown used to that suspicion, but hearing Victor say it aloud made her eyes tremble for a moment. She bit her lip, her hands clenched tightly, the ring blazing, as though it wanted to speak the words Mira couldn't bring herself to say. Aunt Rosa stood silently beside them, her face tense, unable to hide the heavy grief. At last, she sighed, her distant eyes clouded, her voice raspy as if carrying years of restraint. "Yes, Mira is Elena's flesh and blood, and the thread that ties you to my sister. But there's another truth you need to know, one we've kept hidden for many years." Victor turned sharply, his eyes flaring, confusion now laced with fear. He waited for Rosa's next word, his heart pounding like it would explode. She opened a drawer and retrieved a wooden box, placing it gently on the table. Inside were a few yellowed newspapers, their corners stained and edges faded with time. She handed Victor one page, the headline printed in stark black, "Black Woman Dies in Police Pursuit." The words danced before his eyes, each letter striking like a hammer blow, and his breath caught in his throat. Victor's hands shook as he flipped to the next page, reading the brief, clinical line, a late-night pursuit of unclear cause, ending with Elena's car crashing into a utility pole and bursting into flames. Police claimed it was an accident caused by failure to comply with a stop order, but between the cold lines of text, Victor saw too many holes. He knew Elena wasn't reckless. She would never have driven herself into death. Memories spun through his mind, her laughter, her gaze, their secret dates, all blending now with the image of flames engulfing a car on newsprint, tearing his heart wide open. Mira looked at him quietly, her eyes reflecting a sorrow far beyond her years. She spoke softly, her voice low but sharp enough to tear through the silence. They called it an accident, but we all knew it was a cover-up. Victor turned to her, his lips trembling, throat dry. He understood now that Elena hadn't been taken by fate alone. Someone's cruel hand had intervened, turning his love into a tragedy, turning a woman into a victim of abuse of power. The weight of that truth staggered him, draining the strength from his entire body. Aunt Rosa lowered herself beside him, placing her hand gently on Victor's shoulder, her voice deep and sorrowful. We couldn't prove anything. All the evidence was erased, but the pain remained, and Mira grew up in that shadow. She deserves to know where she came from, deserves a father who won't turn away again. Victor closed his eyes tightly, tears falling onto the wooden table, soaking into the photograph of Elena. In that moment, he felt as if he had lost Elena a second time, but at the same time, he saw before him a life carrying half of his blood, sitting there, waiting for him to choose. The room fell silent. Outside, the wind whistled through the gaps in the old tin roof, and the sound of metal clanging echoed in bursts. Victor felt his chest splitting open, both aching and ignited with fire. He knew then, the truth had begun to reveal itself, and from the moment he accepted that Mira was Elena's daughter, there was no turning back. Elena's tragedy had ended in a shadowy chase, but Mira's life was just beginning, and he had no choice but to step into it, not as an outsider. That morning, just as the sun rose, Victor walked into the district police headquarters with a face as cold as steel. The long hallway reeked of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, making it hard to breathe, but he didn't slow down. The police chief's office door flew open at his firm knock. A room cramped files, badges pinned on the walls, and behind a large, rough wooden desk sat a middle-aged man with sharp eyes. The chief looked up, his gaze mocking, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Well, look who's here. What does Millionaire Hayes want from this place?" Victor didn't sit. He stood tall, voice steady. "I'm here to ask about what I witnessed. Abuse of power, intimidation, illegal actions by your men in that neighborhood." The air in the room froze instantly. The chief slowly rose, both hands braced on the desk, his eyes narrowing, each word spat through clenched teeth. "Are you accusing us? You think your voice carries more weight than an entire institution?" Victor didn't back down, his gaze fierce. "I saw it with my own eyes. I'm not just hearing stories anymore. They acted like thugs, and you know it." His voice was so firm it seemed to echo off the walls. A cold smile flickered on the chief's lips. He stepped around the desk, walked up to Victor, stopping just a breath away. His voice dropped, slow and menacing. "Watch your words, Hayes. We have enough files, enough evidence to turn anyone into a criminal overnight. One signature, and tomorrow the press will say you're involved in money laundering, bribery, or whatever story we choose to spin." He let out a dry laugh, the sound cutting through the room like a blade through wood. Victor felt cold sweat trickling down his spine, but he didn't flinch. He knew it was a threat, and for the first time, he realized his own power meant nothing against those who controlled the files. He closed his eyes for a second, then opened them with resolve. "You can fabricate as many files as you want, but the truth doesn't change, and I'll find a way to bring it into the light." His words hit the air like a shockwave. The chief paused, then let out a low chuckle. "The light? In this city, we control the light." The door swung open and several officers entered, eyes cold, forming an unspoken circle around Victor. Standing in the middle, he felt the pressure closing in, but his gaze didn't waver. In his mind, Mira's voice echoed, the words she whispered in the dark. They want to silence every voice. And now, he was seeing exactly how they did it, even to him. Victor's heart pounded, but instead of fear, he felt a hot rush of blood surge through him, pushing him into resistance. He was no longer just an observer. He had become a part of the dark painting Mira once described. The police chief crossed his arms, his tone laced with disdain, edged with caution. "You think you can stand against the system? A millionaire is still just one man. When we decide to make you a criminal, the whole world will believe it because that's how this world works. Victor took a deep breath, responding slowly but firmly. I used to believe that, but now I've seen the truth. And once I've seen it, I can't look away. In that moment, Victor understood that the cracks in power were no longer abstract. They were right here, in the hostile gaze, in the blatant threats. He walked out of the room with heavy but steady steps, fully aware that a storm was about to descend behind him. But he also knew that if he stayed silent, he would become part of the oppression. And Victor Hayes would no longer allow himself to bow his head ever again. Mira stared at Victor, her eyes burning in the dim light of the gray afternoon. Her voice sharp like a blade. See? Money can't save you. The words echoed like a sentence, tightening something in Victor's chest. He had always believed that money was protection, that it could buy favor and cover every vulnerability. But what had just happened in that police office had exposed the raw truth. Those in power could fabricate evidence, twist laws, and for them, money wasn't just not enough. It could be used as justification to destroy him. Victor looked down at his trembling hands, the same hands that had signed billion-dollar contracts, now powerless against the brute force of those he was supposed to trust. He slowly lifted his gaze, eyes scanning the rundown neighborhood before him. Crooked home, children tucked away in shadows, men and women staring at him with a mix of doubt and hope. Victor had never stood in this place, never felt so small before a community long deemed the bottom rung of society. Mira's words echoed in his mind, not as reproach, but as a reckoning. He had seen, he had felt, and he knew that clinging to the pride of wealth would leave him nothing more than a helpless outsider. Mira walked ahead, her small frame firm in every step, not needing to turn to know Victor was behind her. The entire street seemed to watch their footsteps, eyes peering through cracks in doors, soft sighs escaping unseen mouths, all forming a heavy but honest portrait. Victor felt his pace slow, because with each step on that damp ground, he was leaving behind the gleaming world he once lived in and drawing closer to a harsh reality he had never dared to face. He recalled the moment inside the police station, when the threats of fabricated charges were delivered with chilling calm, and he realized he was no different from the poor residents oppressed every day. Wealth had not shielded him from humiliation, had not saved him from the grip of distorted power. Victor clenched his fists, a wave of anger mixed with shame rising in his chest. He had believed he lived on a higher tier, untouched by injustice. But Mira had been right. He had been pulled down too, had become a victim, and that truth, more than anything, made him feel connected to this place, to these people, for the first time. Victor stopped in front of a weather-stained wall where someone had once spray-painted words of protest in red. The letters had been smudged and partially erased, but still read clearly, "We deserve to live." He reached out and touched the faded paint, feeling a tremor rising from within himself. Mira stood beside him, her voice calm and steady. "We don't need someone to save us, but we need someone willing to stand with us." Victor turned, looked deep into her eyes, and saw Elena there, saw all that he had once lost. He drew in a deep breath, as if trying to swallow the fear rising in his throat, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. The neighborhood around them seemed to be still, the whispers gone, and only the wind slipping through rusted tin roofs remained. Victor knew this decision would pull him into a battle money could not protect him from, but he also knew there was no turning back. From the moment he recognized the truth in Mira's words, he could no longer return to the life he once lived, the life of lavish parties and cold contracts. He looked around and saw the faces watching him, and in that moment, Victor Hayes chose to stand with the neighborhood, not as a savior, but as someone ready to share the weight. The Mustang sat quietly at the corner, engine still humming, as if reminding him of the moment that small girl had turned the key and shifted everything. Victor saw clearly, it had never been just about fixing a car, but about the beginning of a journey that forced him to shed his armor of power and face the truth. He turned to Mira, his voice lower but firm. "From now on, I won't walk away." And in Mira's eyes, for the first time, there was a softer light, like a silent acknowledgement that change had truly begun. Night fell over the neighborhood in a thick fog, the damp alleys bathed in weak yellow light. Victor had just finished speaking with a few residents when noise echoed from the end of the alley. Heavy footsteps pounded the ground, mixed with the clinking of metal, making him tense. A group of police officers appeared, flashlights cutting through the small houses. Mira had just stepped into the yard when a beam hit her face directly. Her young face tightened, but her eyes still burned with pride. One officer, without explanation, stepped forward and grabbed her thin arm, squeezing like iron tongs. Mira struggled, but her voice rang out firmly. "You have no right." The words echoed into the darkness, but no one dared respond, drowned out by the wail of a siren signaling an unjust arrest. Victor froze as Mira was dragged away like a criminal. He rushed forward, but two residents held him back, whispering shakily, "Don't! or they'll arrest you too." He shoved them aside, eyes blazing. His heart pounded, Mira's cries cutting into him like a blade. The image of Elena in his memory overlapped with Mira's face, and he couldn't stay still. He ran toward the police car, every step heavy but resolute, knowing he had no choice left. As the police car disappeared with Mira, Victor started his Mustang and followed, his eyes cold, his grip on the wheel so tight it drew blood. The street lay empty under flickering red and blue lights, leading him into a real battle. The police station loomed ahead, a cold block of concrete behind towering iron fences. As soon as he parked, Victor got out without hesitation. He walked straight to the front door, past two guards with folded arms blocking his way. "I want to see the girl you just arrested," he said, his voice booming over the night insect. The two officers exchanged looks, smirking. One stepped forward with a mocking tone. "Mr. Hayes, you're in the wrong place. This isn't a hotel where you get to request visitors." Victor stepped closer, eyes blazing. "She's not a criminal, and you know it. If you don't let her out now, I'll take this public." The officer's laugh rang out like cold metal. "You think the press will listen to you, or to us? You think your money can cover up the fact that you're breaking the law?" Victor didn't back down. His voice cut through the air. "I don't care about money. I care about justice. And tonight I'm not leaving while she's still locked up." The hallway fell briefly silent. Then another officer emerged, face as cold as stone. It was the same man who had cornered him in the office days before. His eyes glinted with contempt. "You really are reckless, Hayes. Tonight's the night you'll regret ever walking into the wolves' den unarmed." At that moment, the public exploded. News spread faster than Victor expected. People around the poor neighborhood whispered, then ran to alert other families. Some filmed it on their phones and uploaded it online within minutes. The headline, "Millionaire Hayes screams inside police station. That child carries my blood," quickly became the center of heated discussion. Short clips capturing the outburst were shared at lightning speed, reaching far beyond the borders of the slum, piercing through the thick glass of the elite towers Victor once frequented. Inside the cold holding cell, Mira heard the shout echoing in. Her eyes widened, chest rising and falling violently. She had never heard Victor admit any blood connection, and that statement shattered the invisible wall between two worlds. Mira gripped the ring tightly, tears welling up, not from fear, but because for the first time in her life, she felt she wasn't completely alone. The police chief struggled to regain composure, his teeth clenched, voice grinding through each word. "You just claimed a colored child as your own? You think that's going to save her? You just destroyed your own reputation." But Victor didn't flinch, his eyes burning, his voice firm. "Reputation means nothing when the truth is buried. If you touch her again, this entire city will know exactly who you are." His words cast a heavy silence over the room, because everyone understood the line had just been crossed. This was no longer about an innocent child being detained, but a direct confrontation between a symbol of financial power and a rotten police system. Outside, the public began to stir. Local newspapers immediately jumped on the story, with some reporters arriving at the slum to ask residents and collect testimonies about the abuses they had endured. Major media outlets ran the story with sensational headlines, tying Victor's name to the shocking family revelation. From lavish parties, where the wealthy once admired him, came whispers of doubt, while in the slums, people began to feel a faint glimmer of hope. Victor knew he had just placed himself in the center of the most dangerous storm. One scream, one sentence, had turned him from an outsider into the one bearing the brunt. But he had no regrets, because deep down, he knew he couldn't stay silent another second. Looking into the police chief's furious eyes, Victor saw it clearly. The truth had just broken free from its shackles, and no matter how hard they tried to crush it, the public would not easily forget that scream. In the darkness of night, that sentence kept echoing, spreading through the alley, piercing shut doors, carving itself into the minds of everyone who witnessed it. It was like a bell tolling, signaling that an unavoidable confrontation had begun, and Victor Hayes, through the simple act of claiming blood, had pulled public attention into a battle that he and Mira no longer had to face alone. News of Victor's explosive declaration spread like wildfire, covering the city overnight. Clips capturing the moment he shouted in the police station were shared at lightning speed, with major newspaper headlines screaming in bold, "Millionaire Hayes admits the detained child is his own." What the police thought would silence him instead became the spark that ignited public outrage. By morning, the first waves of people from the poor neighborhood had gathered in front of the precinct, holding signs scribbled on cardboard, chanting for freedom and justice. It started with a few dozen, but word spread from street to street, growing to hundreds, then thousands. The crowds flooded in, turning the city center into a sea of people. their tired faces now lit with determination. Victor stood within the mass, feeling the power of a community he had once ignored. Those who had long suffered in silence now stood tall, their chants of Free Mira rising in a wave that washed away fear. He had never joined a protest before, but today he did, not as a millionaire, but as a father fighting for his child, and more than that, as a citizen demanding the truth. He saw the eyes around him, filled with years of buried fury, and understood this was no longer just his and Mira's battle, but everyone. The press moved in fast, reporters pushing through the crowd, cameras and microphones raised, broadcasting every moment live. Long-hidden stories began to surface. A grieving mother tearfully recalled her son's death after being detained without cause. The record said an accident, but the bruises told another story. A man raised a broken arm, accusing officers of beating him for resisting an illegal home search. Each account struck like a hammer blow, exposing layers of rot the system had tried to bury. The more voices spoke up, the more fuel the media had, and by the next morning, the front pages no longer featured glamorous elite galas, but the angry faces of everyday people. Television channels ran non-stop updates, showing the crowd stretched across the precinct, holding up signs that read, "We are not afraid anymore. Justice is not a slogan." Anchors expressed visible shock, emphasizing how no grassroots movement had ever swelled so quickly. The images shook the city to its core, forcing long-silent politicians to speak out. Some sidestepped carefully, but others openly called for an investigation. For the first time, those once untouchable had to face the blinding spotlight of public scrutiny. Victor looked around and saw the people from the slums who had hidden in the shadows just the day before now stepping out into the street, shoulder to shoulder with others from across the city. They no longer avoided flashlight beams, no longer stayed silent under scrutiny, but held their signs high and chanted Mira's name as if calling out their own lives. A little girl with nothing but oil-stained hands, an old tool bag, and a worn-out ring had now become the voice of an entire community. Mira stood on the steps, her chest rising and falling, but her eyes were proud and steady, looking straight at those who had placed their trust in her. Victor took one step forward, standing just behind Mira. He could clearly see that the look in the people's eyes had changed. They no longer looked at him with the suspicion of an outsider, but as someone sharing the fight. He had once taken pride in the title of Millionaire, once kept his distance behind a cold coat and a bank account full of zeros. But now he knew he was no longer the same man. He stood silently, no longer wanting to impose, no longer thinking of power or money, but simply as a steady presence beside Mira. It was Mira who had changed him, who had pulled him down from his lofty chair and placed his feet on this dusty road. The chants echoed on, passed from person to person, forming a powerful roar that reverberated across the city. Victor felt himself trembling, but not from fear, from awakening. He saw clearly now that Mira was no longer just a child. She had become a symbol, and that symbol could not stand alone. He stood there, saying nothing, but the look he gave Mira was full of recognition and commitment. For the first time in his life, Victor Hayes was no longer a cold, detached millionaire. He was a father, a companion, a man who had chosen to stand among the small but unyielding. As night fell, the flames from handheld torches lit up the neighborhood. Mira's shadow stretched long across an old wall, small but strong, while Victor stood beside her, silent, firm. They were like two sides of a painting, a child representing the rising future, and a man once bound by power now finding truth in the light of the crowd. Mira had become a symbol of resistance, and Victor, from that moment on, was no longer a bystander. He had stepped into the current of history that the child herself had begun. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. The crowd spilled outside, hastily erected security barricades failing to contain the wave of people holding signs and chanting Mira's name. Journalists jostled for space, camera lenses trained on the large wooden doors where Victor and Mira would enter. Inside the courtroom, stark white light poured down, wooden benches packed tightly, the air thick as if every breath waited for a truth about to be unveiled. On the bench, the ring sat inside a clear glass box, gleaming under the lights, yet bearing more weight than any stack of documents. Victor sat in the witness chair, his face lined with exhaustion from the past days of tension, but his eyes were bright, no longer holding any hesitation. Mira sat beside him, small but proud, her hand trembling slightly on her lap, her dark eyes locked on the ring. When the people's lawyer stood, his voice echoed powerfully. "This ring is not just a piece of jewelry. It is proof of a connection, of a story that was buried." The words stirred the room, every gaze shifting to Mira, then to Victor. An old photograph was held up, showing Elena, a woman of color with a gentle smile, wearing that very ring. Victor swallowed hard, memories crashing over him like waves, but he no longer looked away. When asked, he spoke slowly. "Yeah, that is Elena, the woman I once loved, who disappeared from my life because of family pressure and social prejudice." Victor paused, eyes red, but voice firm. "And Mira, the child sitting here, carries the blood of me and Elena. This ring is the thread that connects us. Undeniable proof." The courtroom erupted. Some gasped in shock. Others applauded loudly. Journalists typed furiously, capturing every word. The police side tried to maintain composure, but many faces had gone pale. They were used to burying truth with power. But this time, the evidence was a small object they could not erase. The ring gleamed, shimmering like the light of truth piercing through layers of deception. Mira held her head high, her eyes blazing as she heard Victor's admission. She turned to him, her gaze wet but proud. She didn't need to speak, for in her look was gratitude, pride, and the pain now finally given a name. Victor clasped Mira's hand, his own trembling, but not from fear. This was the tremble of a man finally facing his past. The lawyer continued questioning, now about the events that led to Elena's disappearance. Victor confessed the entire truth, how his family had objected, how he had been too weak to fight, and the price Elena paid for raising their child alone. Each word felt like a blade to Victor's heart, but each also pieced together the full picture, revealing the truth in the open. He no longer stood as the cold millionaire, but as a man owning his mistakes, standing up to protect his daughter with everything he had. The prosecutor representing the police tried to interrupt, claiming the ring was just a coincidence, that there was no test proving any relationship. But when Mira was invited to the stand, she raised her small hand, the ring glowing under the courtroom lights. She looked directly at the bench, her voice ringing out, "This ring is not stolen, not a trick. It belonged to my mother, Elena. She gave it to me before she left, telling me it was proof of the life she once lived. I don't wear it to show off. I wear it to prove that we deserve respect." The courtroom fell silent for a few seconds. Then thunderous applause erupted. Journalists stood, camera shutters clicking rapidly. The police side remained quiet, heads bowed, because they knew every argument they'd prepared had collapsed. The connection between Victor, Elena, and Mira was now clear as day. A small object, yet it held the power of undeniable truth. Victor felt a warm current rush through him. For the first time in years, he no longer felt haunted by past cowardice. He looked at Mira and realized she was not just his blood, but his redemption, his hope for a more just path. The ring sparkled on her hand, once a symbol of pain, now a piece of evidence that could not be refuted, a bell marking the beginning of an era where truth would be heard. Deep down, Victor knew this courtroom was not just handling a case. It had become the people's court, where justice finally found a voice louder than any authority. The police began to falter, their arguments shattered by the ring and the testimonies. Forged records, once used to intimidate the community, now turned into evidence against them. Every detail brought forth by Victor and Mira was captured by the press and spread everywhere. The prosecutor's voice wavered as he fumbled over irrelevant details, each question only fueling public outrage. A few officers in the audience bowed their heads, unable to look up, knowing the truth had spun beyond their control. The once familiar image of law enforcers now resembled those who abused their uniforms to suppress and oppress, all unfolding within the very court meant to uphold justice. Victor saw the shift clearly. He realized that with every testimony, every glance, the police's authority was cracking. They were no longer the impenetrable wall he once feared. Now they were flustered, off balance, scrambling to delay. Mira sat calmly, her eyes glowing, needing neither shouting nor rage to speak for her. The truth alone was enough to corner the powerful. He could feel every breath in the room pressing in on the police, turning them from accusers into the accused. Outside the courthouse, the crowd kept growing. Handwritten signs were raised high, and thousands of voices chanted in unison, "Justice for Mira, justice for the people." The chants were no longer just about the fate of one child. They had become the unified voice of a city exhausted from being ruled by fear. Each cry struck like a blow against the wall of power, making those inside tremble. Victor stood, looking out the window, where citizens packed shoulder to shoulder under the harsh sun, and not one of them left. He saw the wrinkled face of Mrs. Clara, the bandaged arm of Uncle David, and the children who once clung to their parents now shouting boldly. They had all become one unstoppable wave. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere grew hotter with every heartbeat. A journalist abruptly stood up and raised a microphone, asking bluntly, "Chief, how do you explain the years of abuse of power?" There was no clear answer, only a hardened glare and silence. That silence echoed louder than any confession. When the people outside heard what had happened, their chants surged louder. "We want the truth. We want justice." Victor turned to look at Mira. He saw her small shoulders trembling, not from fear, but from emotion. She was witnessing an entire community stand beside her, turning personal pain into collective strength. He squeezed her hand tightly, as if making a vow that no one would have to fight alone again. Mira gave a faint smile, one filled with belief, her eyes glowing with pride. She knew the road ahead would still be long, but this moment was proof that justice could be reclaimed when people stopped being afraid. The chants outside continued to crash against the courthouse walls, blending with the pounding of the judge's gavel. That sound was not just the rhythm of a trial, it was the voice of a new era being born. In Victor's mind, he heard each beat like a bell tolling, reminding him that once truth is brought to light, it cannot be buried again. The police could try to evade it, could remain silent, but they had already been pushed into a corner where public opinion and justice converged. And as the chants of justice for Mira swelled into a rising sea of sound, Victor understood that he and Mira were no longer alone. This was no longer a story about one family, but a verdict handed down by the people against those who abused power. Justice had begun to be named, not by the hands of those seated on high, but by the thousands of voices echoing from the pavement, from the hearts of those once buried in the dark. After the trial, the wave of public outcry erupted with force. Investigative reports surfaced one after another, tearing apart the polished image the police force had built over the years. Journalists dug into old case files and uncovered a slew of suppressed incidents. Civilians beaten without cause, families losing their homes due to falsified reports, and even mysterious deaths recorded as accident. Evidence that had long gathered dust in archives was now brought into the light, stacking into a full picture of a rotten system. No one could deny it anymore, as every line, every figure, every photo exposed the truth that the people had been forced to endure in silence for years. Victor followed every update, each printed article leaving him speechless. He no longer saw isolated details, but a web of power that had turned the law into a weapon of oppression. Now, the web was unraveling, each link breaking under pressure from the courts and the people. Mira sat beside him, her eyes gleaming, unable to hide her joy as the stories once whispered in the shadows of the community now filled front pages. The child, once shamed, had become a living witness to change, and the fire in her eyes reminded Victor that this was only the beginning. That evening's news broadcast listed the names of officers suspended for investigation. The anchor's voice rang out. More than 20 officers stripped of their ranks, many facing potential criminal charges. Names once thought untouchable appeared on screen alongside accusations of abuse of power, corruption, and covering up crimes. Inside the police department, the atmosphere was in chaos. Once arrogant faces now lowered in fear for their careers and freedom. The image of the police chief seated before an investigative panel, sweat beading his forehead, became the symbol of a crumbling regime. The crowd outside the courthouse did not disperse. They continued to march through the streets, raising signs and shouting chants. This time, they weren't just demanding justice for Mira, but for everyone. "No more silence, no more fear," became the phrase printed on thousands of signs. People from all corners joined. Even those from affluent neighborhoods who had once looked away now took to the streets, realizing that this truth was no longer confined to a poor community, but was a disease rotting the entire city from within. Victor walked among the crowd, no longer in a sleek suit, no longer wearing the cold facade. He walked with them, listening to every story, every tear, every hopeful laugh. He saw his reflection in the eyes of those once oppressed, and realized he had truly stepped down from the ivory tower of the elite. Mira walked beside him, small but unwavering, gripping his hand tightly. They were no longer just two individuals standing against the system. They had an entire sea of people behind them. In the days that followed, the federal court stepped in, and case files were expanded. Independent oversight organizations also released detailed reports on the abuse of power by the police force over many years. Every number, every piece of evidence presented felt like a hammer blow, cracking further the wall of power once thought unshakable. The police chief and senior officers were taken into custody, and the images of them walking in handcuffs spread across television screens, affirming that justice had finally been served. Victor stood on the steps of the government building as the news broke. He heard the crowd erupt in cheers, people hugging each other through tears, some laughing with joy, others lifting their faces to the sky as if to tell the departed that justice had finally arrived. Mira cried too, but they were clear, pure tears, a belief that hope could sprout from a land once saturated with injustice. Victor wrapped his arms around her and whispered, "You did it." The fall of power did not happen in an instant, but through a series of days peeled back layer by layer. From Victor's shout inside the police station, to the ring placed before the court, to the thousands of voices echoing through the streets. And now, as those who once held high positions were brought down, Victor understood this was not just his or Mira's victory, but a triumph for everyone who had ever been forced into silence. In the glowing morning light, he saw a new city rising, where justice was no longer an empty slogan, but a truth written in blood, in tears, and in the courage of small but unbreakable people. After the sentences were handed down, the city felt as if it had awoken from a long nightmare. The media didn't just report on the fall of a corrupt system, but also on the change sparked by those who dared to stand up. In that context, Victor Hayes did not return to a life of glittering parties and luxury. He stepped in front of the press and announced he would dedicate the majority of his wealth to creating a development fund for the very neighborhood where Mira and her community had lived in darkness for so many years. The decision made waves, not just because of the enormous figure he revealed, but because it marked the shedding of his cold millionaire persona, replaced by someone willing to place his faith in the strength of a community. The fund was simply named Light of Justice, tied to the message that even places buried in darkness could be reborn. Old houses were repaired, children had books for school, and families who had suffered from wrongful acts received support. Victor didn't just sign checks and walk away. He showed up at every project, sat down to hear people's stories, and shared humble meals in wooden homes. That image spread across news outlets, forcing even the skeptics to admit that the change in him was real. Mira became an indispensable presence at every meeting of the foundation. She sat beside Victor, small but full of confidence, her eyes lighting up as she presented ideas for building a community center, a vocational space for teenagers, or a playground for children. The people listened to Mira, applauded in support, and no longer saw her as a lone child, but as a guiding symbol. Victor always sat behind, his eyes filled with pride, sometimes nodding, sometimes smiling, letting the girl speak on behalf of them all. At the inauguration of the first community library, hundreds gathered, with a photograph of Mira wearing the shining ring hung on the wall, beside the slogan, "Justice begins with truth." When Victor stepped onto the stage, he paused for a moment, his eyes turning toward Mira standing right beside him. But before he could speak, Mira stepped forward, her voice rising, stronger than the loudspeakers. "We have won." The short sentence silenced the entire room for a beat. Then it erupted with applause and cheers. It was not a boast, but a declaration of a long journey marked by blood, tears, and hope. Victor stood behind, his eyes burning. He knew Mira wasn't just speaking of victory over a corrupt police force, but of the triumph of those once disregarded, the triumph of courage and unity. From that moment, he clearly saw a different future unfolding, a future where Mira could hold her head high without being looked down upon, where this community could walk forward in the light, and where he himself had rediscovered the humanity he thought he had lost. That night, after the crowd had dispersed, Victor remained sitting on the steps with Mira, watching the yellow streetlights cast their glow on a street now brighter than ever. He softly said, "You didn't just save the car, you saved my whole life." Mira smiled, lifted her head high, her hand still gripping the ring. Children's laughter echoed from the end of the street, carried on the cool night breeze, like a promise that past pain had now been replaced by hope. In that moment, Victor realized the greatest victory was not in seeing the guilty punished, but in watching ordinary people finally lift their heads and live without shame. After months of intense struggle, once the movement had spread throughout the city, the impoverished community finally had a place to begin again. No longer were there only dark, crumbling homes or shadowy alleys. Now, a small but meaningful garage stood right at the heart of the neighborhood. The sign above read a short name, yet it captured an entire journey of blood, tears, and hope. Freedom Garage. Victor was the one who funded its construction, but he took no credit, simply saying it was a gift from those who had dared to rise up. On Inauguration Day, the crowd was packed tight, and cheers erupted as Mira held the small scissors and cut the red ribbon at the entrance. She was no longer the child mocked by the roadside, but the face of a new beginning, a place where freedom was embodied in every bolt, every wire, every machine. Freedom Garage was unlike any garage Victor had ever owned. It wasn't profit-driven, nor did it serve the elite, but opened its doors to all the children of the neighborhood, to families eager to learn a trade and support themselves. Inside, the walls were painted bright and lined with tools supplied by Victor. On each workbench sat the old toolboxes Mira once carried, now placed with honor, a symbol of humble beginnings. Mira stepped in, inhaling deeply the scent of oil, metal, the familiar air of a world she loved. She looked up at everyone, eyes blazing, and declared, This isn't just a place to crash. This is where we learn to stand tall and never let anyone look down on us. Thunderous applause followed, and the worn, weary faces now glowed with belief. From the very first day, Mira took on the role of mentor. Though still young, she had learned how to teach, her oil-stained hands gripping wrenches, patiently showing other kids how to remove a tire, change a spark plug, clean an engine. Children who once hid in the shadows now gathered around, eyes wide as they watched her every move. They cheered when a bolt came loose, when the engine roared to life after hours of tinkering, and that joy spread like new breath throughout the space. Mothers stood at a distance, eyes gleaming as they saw their children given a chance, and the thin, worn fathers stepped closer too, asking to learn a few skills so they wouldn't have to depend on anyone else. Victor was always present in the garage, not as a commander, but as a quiet learner. He sat on a wooden chair, watching Mira with deep emotion. In every word she used to teach the kids, he saw glimpses of Elena, the patience, the strength that never backed down. Each time Mira bent down to guide a child's hand on a wrench, Victor recalled a moment long ago, when Elena had placed her hand on his and said, "Don't let fear make your choices." Now, Mira was repeating that same message, not in words, but through her actions and her very presence. Freedom Garage quickly became a gathering place for the entire community. Every weekend, kids crowded in with old bicycles, motorbikes, and even broken appliances to be fixed, learning while laughing. The sound of engines mixed with laughter echoed through the street, wiping away the heavy air of years under oppression. Those who once lived in fear now held their heads high, knowing they finally had a place to belong, a space where anyone could learn and rise together. The garage walls were decorated with paintings made by the children themselves, Mira turning a wrench under the light, Victor raising his hand high, homes lit up with hope. Each brushstroke was a reminder that they had passed through darkness to reclaim the light. Mira stepped into the middle of the garage one afternoon, golden sunlight streaming through the windows onto her face. She looked up, her eyes shimmering as she spoke clearly for all to hear. "We have won, but this is only the beginning. We didn't win by defeating anyone. We won by proving our worth." Her words silenced everyone for a moment. Then the garage exploded in applause, bright smiles spreading all around. Victor's chest burned warm. He knew Mira was no longer just a child carrying his bloodline, but had become the spirit of an entire community. As night fell, the lights in Freedom Garage stayed on. The clinks of tools echoed, mingling with soft voices. Victor looked at the scene, thinking he had never felt so rich. Not because of any number in a bank account, but because of the life coming alive before him. Mira kept guiding the kids, hair damp with sweat, her smile radiant. Under the lights of the garage, the ring on her hand shimmered again like a guiding star. A reminder that justice could be built from the smallest things as long as there was faith and courage. And among the noise of machines, Victor whispered to himself, "This is the real legacy." Victor sat quietly on a wooden chair in the corner of the garage, his eyes following Mira's every move as she worked among the eager kids learning to fix bikes. He didn't interrupt, didn't speak, only watched in silence, feeling a pride that words couldn't express. A man once used to seeing life through reports and numbers now found joy and laughter rising among old engines, in small hands covered in grease but glowing with passion. He saw Mira standing in the center, eyes ablaze, her hands steady as she taught each motion, just like Elena once did when she passionately explained her books. That image made Victor's eyes well up, because he knew how proud Elena would be if she were alive to see her daughter lighting up an entire community. He stood still, realizing that the same child once cast aside on the highway had now become a source of inspiration for the entire neighborhood. Every word Mira spoke, every smile she gave, lit up the faces around her. Victor saw true strength in her, a kind of strength his money could never buy. He felt proud not just because Mira carried his blood, but because she had broken through every barrier to prove her worth. In that moment, Victor no longer felt like a millionaire burdened by guilt, but a father, a witness to his daughter's growth. In the corner of the garage, the once shiny black Mustang now sat proudly as an irreplaceable symbol. It had once smoked on the highway, the starting point of shame and confrontation, but now gleamed under the lights of Freedom Garage. Mira, alongside Victor and the people of the neighborhood, had restored every detail, replaced every worn-out part, and polished every inch of paint. When the engine roared to life for the first time after its revival, the garage erupted in cheers. No longer was the Mustang seen as a luxury toy of a millionaire, but as a living testament to rebirth. Every child who stepped into the garage heard the story of that car, how a small girl had brought it back to life amid ridicule and threats, and from there, sparked an entire movement. The Mustang became the pride of Freedom Garage, placed at the center, so each time its engine echoed, it served as a reminder of the struggles they had overcome. Victor often stood before it, placing his hand on the glossy hood, feeling as though he were touching both memory and present. He too had been reborn, just like the Mustang, from someone defeated in darkness to a man who had rediscovered the true meaning of his life. The community didn't see the Mustang as just a machine, but as the heart of the garage. It brought people together, from fathers learning to fix engines to feed their families, to children changing spark plugs with their own hands for the first time. Everyone who touched it felt part of something greater, a story of defiance and belief. Mira often gathered the kids around the Mustang, pointing out its parts, retelling the day she and Victor were cornered on the highway, and young eyes lit up as if drawing strength from her words. Victor understood that the Mustang no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the entire neighborhood, to those who had once been dismissed but now stood tall. When he saw Mira standing by the car, the light from her ring reflecting off the glossy black paint, he knew a new chapter had begun. The garage, Mira, the Mustang, all had blended into an enduring symbol of rebirth. And in that moment, he smiled, telling himself that if there were any legacy worth leaving behind, this was exactly what he had been searching for. On the last afternoon of the year, Freedom Garage still glowed with lights, the sounds of engines mixing with children's laughter echoing across the neighborhood. Victor sat on the wooden chair in the corner, watching Mira show the kids how to change oil, her tiny hands moving quickly, as if she was born for this work. He slowly stood up and walked over, his gaze gentle but filled with deep emotion. As Mira looked up, Victor placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low, steady in the oil-scented air. Leadership isn't pulling others along, it's learning how to follow. The words made every child in the garage pause and listen, while Mira froze slightly, her eyes surprised before turning warm. Victor knew he had once mistaken strength for control, for power and money. He had believed leadership meant standing in front, forcing others to follow. But now, after everything, he understood the truth was the opposite. Mira, the one who seemed smallest and most fragile, had shown him that true strength was in listening, in acknowledging, in following the belief of a community. He smiled, no longer the arrogant millionaire, but a man who had learned the final lesson after a long road of loss and awakening. Mira looked up, eyes clear, lips forming a soft smile. On her hand, the familiar ring still shimmered under the warm light, reflecting like a small flame that would never go out. She didn't need to say much, just nodded slightly, her smile carrying both gratitude and pride. To Mira, Victor's words weren't just an acknowledgement. They were a promise that from now on, they would walk together, with no distance left between them. The kids cheered again and returned to their work, while Victor and Mira stood side by side, looking at the Mustang resting in the corner, a symbol of the community's rebirth. That car, once abandoned on the highway, once a mark of shame, now stood as a witness to the journey toward justice. Mira placed her small hand on the hood, the ring glinting once more, as if closing the story with a statement. Justice is never far away. It can start from the smallest hand. Victor exhaled, but it was the sigh of peace. He had lived through the days of running, of clinging to power to hide his own fear. Now, standing in the garage, hearing the laughter, the engines, he truly felt he belonged. He understood that the final lesson wasn't just for him, but for all who were watching. Leadership isn't about standing at the top, but about the courage to kneel down and walk beside. Mira smiled, the ring shining in the darkness, and all around seemed to nod in agreement, recognizing that this journey had ended in a true victory of the human spirit. In the bright light of Freedom Garage, as the Mustang engine roared to life once more, Victor and Mira stepped toward the door together. Their shadows stretched long across the concrete floor, one tall, one small, but their footsteps were steady. They were no longer a millionaire and a scorned child of color, but two people bound by truth and belief. The final lesson was clear, echoing in the hearts of all who watched. True leadership is not about forcing others to follow, but walking together. Mira tilted her head slightly, her smile radiant, the ring on her finger gleaming like a tiny star, closing a journey filled with tears, yet overflowing with hope. That day, more people gathered around Freedom Garage than ever before, not to fix their vehicles or seek help, but to witness a moment seen as a symbol of change. As Mira stepped into the yard, her hands still streaked with grease, a cheer erupted like a rising wave. Victor followed behind, his face marked by age, but his eyes calm and clear. Children raised signs painted in red, "We have won," and "Justice for all." No one gave instructions, no chants were needed, yet the whole neighborhood moved with one shared breath. Morning sunlight poured down, glinting off the ring on Mira's hand like a guiding light. The entire community beamed, their bright smiles replacing the long days of gloom, applause echoing as if to hold on to the moment forever. Victor stood in the circle of people, looking around at faces that once showed exhaustion now lit with joy. at men who once bowed their heads now holding them high, at women who once cried in silence now holding each other tightly. He heard the cheers, but inside, another sound stirred, the sound of responsibility. He understood that justice doesn't arrive by miracle. It comes from hands brave enough to rise in protest, from feet that dared move toward the light. Mira was the spark, but that spark only ignited because of the wind, the ordinary people who chose not to remain silent. He smiled, eyes misting, because in that crowd, he saw Elena smiling too, from some distant place, witnessing her daughter become the symbol of everything she once gave up for. Mira didn't say much. She simply raised her hand and said clearly, "We stood up, and we will never bow our heads again." The words hit like thunder, and cheers exploded down the street. Children ran in circles, celebrating like it were a festival. Adults embraced, holding each other tightly to make up for all the years of quiet endurance. Mira looked up at the deep blue sky, her smile gentle, but her eyes shining with resolve. She knew the journey wasn't over, but today's victory had proven a truth no one could deny. When people dare to rise, justice will belong to them. Morning sunlight stretched across the crooked rooftops, revealing every crack and patch of worn-out walls. But instead of feeling bleak, the light made them feel warm, as if protect those who once feared the police, who once stayed silent under humiliation, now dared to raise their voices in song. The sound of drums made from rusty cans echoed through the alleyway, forming the rhythm of freedom. Victor stood in the middle of it all, feeling deeply that the rebirth wasn't just in the building, not just in Freedom Garage or the Mustang, but within every heart that had awakened. He saw eyes filled with belief, and he knew that for the first time in his life, he was truly alive. The Mustang was pushed into the yard, its engine roaring like a greeting. Applause erupted, and children scrambled to climb onto the door to touch the symbol of a resurrected journey. Victor sat in the driver's seat but didn't start the car. He simply placed his hand on the steering wheel and looked at Mira, as if to say this car was no longer his alone, but belonged to the entire community. Mira smiled and nodded gently, as if she understood. The crowd cheered around them, and within that sound, Victor clearly heard a deep affirmation. Justice had returned, not through power, but through the resilience of small people. The sun climbed higher, casting golden light over the metal rooftops and shining down on faces held high. Laughter, applause, and joyful voices mingled in a new kind of celebration. Everyone knew the wounds hadn't disappeared, that the old system still left scars, but what mattered was, they had proven silence wasn't destiny. They could rise, speak, and bring change. Mira became living proof, the ring glowing brightly on her hand like a torch, lighting the way for brave footsteps. As dusk fell and the final light of day bathed the neighborhood in gold, Victor sat beside Mira on the garage steps. He listened to the wind passing through, carrying the echoes of a day no one would forget. Mira turned slightly, her eyes shimmering, her lips curved into a peaceful smile. No more words were needed. Both of them understood that this story had ended with a message clear, simple, and powerful. Justice belongs to those who dare to stand, no matter how small they are. That wasn't a slogan. It was truth written in blood, in tears, in every courageous step taken along a difficult road. And from that day on, whenever sunlight poured down on Freedom Garage, whenever the Mustang's engine roared, the community remembered their journey, one that proved there is no force stronger than unity, no darkness that can hide the light of courage. The story had ended, but its message would echo far beyond the poor neighborhood, beyond the city, becoming a belief for anyone who ever thought they were too small to change the world. The story closed not just with the cheers of a poor neighborhood that had reclaimed its voice, but with the transformation of every person who had endured its trials. Victor Hayes, once a cold millionaire who believed power and wealth were his shield, had to face shock after shock to realize the truth, that there are moments when everything he owns cannot protect him. The night he shouted in the police station, admitting Mira carried his blood, was the moment all distance was erased, the moment a once arrogant man chose to stand with the powerless. Mira, once a dark-skinned child mocked and belittled, became the light for an entire community, not through rage, but through faith, resilience, and the pride inherited from her mother Elena. From the stalled Mustang on the highway to the laughter-filled Freedom Garage, the journey became a vast portrait of transformation. The Mustang was no longer just Victor's possession, but a symbol of rebirth, of the strength found in perseverance. Just like Mira, who once wandered the dusty streets, now stood as a teacher in the garage, showing the kids not only how to fix engines, but how to stand tall in life. The children who once trembled and hid in shadows now raised their hands and cheered, having learned from Mira that small does not mean weak, and that justice can begin with even the most fragile-looking hand. The lesson of this story did not lie in the downfall of corrupt officers, but in the far-reaching power of truth. A system that once seemed unshakable was exposed, not by a single powerful figure, but by a united community that dared to rise. The chants outside the courthouse, the sight of thousands holding signs, proved that justice was no longer locked in files, but now belonged to the people. Victor had learned the most important truth. Leadership is not about commanding, but about walking alongside others, about having the courage to bow down and truly listen. Mira smiled, the ring shimmering on her hand, a living reminder that Elena's memory had never faded, but continued to live on in the next generation. In this journey, the greatest change did not lie in buildings erected, but in the awakening within people's hearts. Those who once endured in silence now knew how to resist. Families once voiceless had learned to speak up, and children once dismissed now held their heads high. Freedom Garage was no longer just a repair shop. It became a symbol of a new chapter, where knowledge and hope were shared, where the past was faced so it would not be repeated. Every engine that roared there was more than just machinery. It was the voice of the people, the sound proving that even from ruin, future could be built. The final message left by the story is simple yet powerful. Justice is not a gift handed down from above, but the result of people who dare to stand up. Mira's courage, Victor's awakening, and the unity of the community proved that no one is destined to live in the shadows. No matter how small they are, once they dare to speak, to act, they can shift the course of everything. This story does not just recount the journey of two people in search of justice, but stands as a reminder to all of us that light can always rise, even from the darkest places. And in the golden sunlight shining down on Freedom Garage, as children's laughter echoed and the Mustang roared like the heartbeat of the entire neighborhood, that lesson became even clearer. Justice belongs to those who dare to rise, and it is they who truly change the world. Mira held her head high, Victor smiled, the community held hands, all forming a vivid portrait, affirming that from pain came hope, from darkness came light, and from smallness rose a strength that could not be broken.